History isn't a story of genius. It's a long, embarrassing chain of catastrophic accidents, panicked decisions, and spectacular miscalculations. And every single one of them shaped the world you're living in right now. 1. The world's most iconic short man joke has been running for over 2 centuries, and the punchline is that the man at the center of it was completely average height. Napoleon Bonaparte stood approximately 5 feet 7 inches tall, comfortably within the normal range for a French man of his era. The confusion didn't come from a tape measure. It came from a British political cartoonist named James Gilray, who caricatured him as Little Boney during wartime specifically to make the enemy look small and ridiculous. That's not history. That's propaganda doing exactly what propaganda is designed to do. There's a second layer to this embarrassment. Napoleon was always surrounded by his imperial guard, who had strict minimum height requirements for enlistment, meaning he was perpetually the shortest man in his own immediate vicinity through pure structural bad luck. And then there's the unit conversion problem. The French inch and the English inch were different measurements, which made his recorded height read as 5 feet 2 in English records. An entire psychological complex was named after a man who wasn't even short. That's the equivalent of inventing a phobia and forgetting to check whether the original spider was real. 2. Every struggling student's favorite comfort blanket is the Einstein failed math story, and it is a complete fabrication built on a misread report card. Einstein never failed mathematics. He mastered differential and integral calculus before the age of 15, and found the suggestion so absurd that he responded to it directly in 1935, calling the claim nonsense. The myth almost certainly originated from a misreading of the Swiss grading system, where a 6 is the highest possible mark, not a failing score. Someone read his transcript backwards, panicked, and the story escaped into the educational ecosystem before anyone bothered to check. Einstein was admitted to ETH Zurich, one of Europe's most technically demanding universities, after a single entrance exam. He only stumbled on the French language section, a subject with no connection to mathematics or physics, which is the academic equivalent of a concert pianist being criticized for not also being fluent in Mandarin. His teachers in Munich consistently described him as exceptional in the subjects that actually mattered. Generations of students have used Einstein as their excuse not to study, citing a man who studied obsessively. That is a level of irony that should appear on a standardized test somewhere. 3. Here's what you were taught. 1492. Brave Christopher Columbus sets sail while a terrified medieval world cowers at the edge of a flat earth, convinced his ships will drop off the planet. Here is what actually happened. Educated Europeans had known the earth was spherical for nearly 2,000 years before Columbus boarded a single ship. The ancient Greek mathematician Eratosthenes calculated the Earth's circumference with remarkable accuracy around 240 BC using shadow angles and basic geometry. Medieval universities taught the spherical Earth as established fact. The Catholic Church did not oppose it. Flat Earth belief was a fringe position, not mainstream consensus in Columbus's era. The myth of widespread flat Earth belief was largely invented by Washington Irving in an 1828 fictional biography of Columbus, which generations of teachers then treated as documented history rather than historical fiction. Columbus's actual navigational error ran in the opposite direction entirely. He dramatically underestimated the Earth's circumference, calculating the distance to Asia as roughly 1/4 of its real size. He didn't prove the Earth was round. He just got spectacularly lucky that an entirely unknown continent was sitting in the gap created by his bad math. History rewarded his miscalculation with a holiday. 4. Somewhere in your education, a teacher pointed at a map and told you that the Great Wall of China is the only human-made structure visible from space with the naked eye. This fact has been repeated with such confidence and such frequency that questioning it feels almost unpatriotic. No astronaut has ever reliably confirmed seeing the wall from low Earth orbit without optical aids. Multiple astronauts have specifically looked and failed. The most definitive debunking came from Yang Liwei, China's own first astronaut and a national hero, who publicly stated he could not see the wall from orbit despite searching for it specifically. A statement so uncomfortable that it prompted a curriculum review in China. The physics explain why. The wall averages only 15 to 30 feet wide, which is comparable to a highway, and highways are not visible from space with the naked eye, regardless of their length. At 250 miles of altitude, the human eye simply cannot resolve an object that narrow. The claim appears in print as early as 1932, predating spaceflight entirely, meaning it was declared a fact decades before anyone could technically test it. The wall survived Mongolian invasions and didn't survive a single astronaut glancing out a porthole. 5. The Viking helmet with magnificent curving horns jutting from either side is one of history's most successful costume choices and one of its most complete inventions. No Norse warrior wore a horned helmet into battle. Not one. The image was created by a 19th century costume designer for an opera, and it has been retroactively applied to an entire civilization ever since. The single most famous so-called Viking horned helmet artifact, found in Växjö, Denmark, dates to approximately 900 BC, roughly 2,000 years before the Viking Age, and was almost certainly ceremonial rather than military. Actual excavated Viking battle helmets were rounded iron or leather caps, sometimes with a simple nose guard. Functional, unglamorous, and hornless. The iconic image was substantially popularized by Swedish artist Gustav Malmström in the 1870s and cemented by costume designer Carl Emil Dupler for Wagner's opera cycle in 1876. Beyond the historical fabrication, consider the military logic. Horns on a combat helmet would catch sword blows, tangle in undergrowth, and provide your opponent a convenient handle to wrench your head sideways during close combat. The most feared warriors in European history have been remembered entirely through the lens of opera costuming. Their legacy was redesigned by someone who needed the stage show to look dramatic. 6. Every 4th of July, fireworks explode over a nation celebrating the precise moment the Founding Fathers gathered around a table and signed the Declaration of Independence together. The date is correct. The event is not. Most delegates did not sign on July 4th. The date marks the adoption of the text, not the signing ceremony, which happened primarily on August 2nd, 1776, nearly a month later. The Continental Congress voted to adopt the Declaration on July 4th, but the formal signing by most delegates occurred weeks afterward. Several delegates who eventually signed were not even present in Philadelphia in early July. Some signatures were added even later than August. John Hancock's famous oversized signature, the one every American can picture, was almost certainly signed on August 2nd, not July 4th. The confusion persists, partly because the document itself is dated July 4th as a political statement of when independence was declared, not when the physical signing ceremony took place. The nation celebrates the wrong date with industrial-grade enthusiasm every single year. The actual signing day, August 2nd, passes without a single firework. History's most important autograph session doesn't even get a day off from work. 7. You survived one disaster, one failure, one close call, and conventional wisdom assures you. Relax. Lightning never hits the same spot twice. You are statistically safe now. Lightning absolutely, repeatedly, and enthusiastically strikes the same places multiple times, and it does so for the same physical reason every single time it happens. The Empire State Building is struck by lightning approximately 20 to 25 times per year. It was struck 8 times in 24 minutes during a single storm. Lightning follows the path of least electrical resistance to the ground, meaning tall conductive objects are struck repeatedly, not by coincidence, but by physics. Park rangers in Shenandoah National Park recorded one individual, Roy Sullivan, being struck by lightning 7 separate times over 35 years, making him the documented world record holder for lightning strike survival. The phrase almost certainly originated as a metaphorical expression about unlikely events and was then gradually mistaken for a literal meteorological principle, which is a category error with potentially lethal consequences. This myth is so persistent that people actively use it as a survival strategy. You are making life decisions based on a metaphor that was never intended to describe weather. The lightning doesn't know what your grandmother told you, and it is not consulting her before it strikes. 8. The image is burned into cultural memory. Rome in flames, Emperor Nero lounging back, sawing cheerfully away on his fiddle, completely unbothered by the screaming city below. There are two insurmountable problems with this picture. The fiddle was not invented until approximately the early 16th century AD, which places it roughly 1400 years after Nero's death in 68 AD. And multiple historical accounts place him not in Rome at all when the fire started, but actively organizing relief efforts once he returned. Tacitus, who was no admirer of Nero and said so at length, recorded that Nero was in Antium, about 35 miles from Rome, when the fire broke out in 64 AD and returned to the city promptly. Tacitus also notes that Nero opened his own palaces and gardens to displaced Roman citizens and organized food supply efforts during the disaster. Nero almost certainly played the lyre, not a fiddle, and while the accusation of him performing during the fire exists in some ancient sources, it appears to be political character assassination from his many documented enemies. Nero had plenty of real disasters attached to his name, but the one everyone repeats is probably the invented one, which is its own form of historical justice. 9. A single dramatic apple drops from a tree, bounces off the greatest scientific mind in history, and instantly produces the universal law of gravitation. Science was apparently just waiting for the right piece of fruit. Newton never claimed an apple hit him. The apple story was an illustrative anecdote he told in old age about a moment of contemplation, not a physical blow that triggered sudden revelation. The account comes primarily from William Stukeley's memoir of Newton's life, written decades after the alleged event, in which Stukeley recorded Newton describing watching an apple fall while already thinking about gravity, not being struck by one while thinking about nothing. Newton had been working on gravitational theory for years before any apple story. His work on calculus and orbital mechanics was already underway at Cambridge before the plague sent him home to Woolsthorpe in 1666. Voltaire also wrote about the apple story, heard secondhand from Newton's niece, contributing significantly to its spread across Europe. The apple, if it existed as a real moment at all, was a prompt for already developing thinking, not a miraculous revelation delivered by fruit. Newton basically created modern physics, and history responded by turning him into a cartoon character who needed produce thrown at his head to think clearly. 10. The starving peasants are at the palace gates, and the Queen of France airily waves her hand. Let them eat cake. The guillotine practically schedules itself. There is zero verified historical evidence that Marie Antoinette ever said this. The phrase, let them eat brioche, brioche being an enriched bread, not cake, appears in Jean-Jacques Rousseau's Confessions, written around 1765, when Marie Antoinette was approximately 9 years old and still living in Austria. Rousseau attributed the remark to a great princess without naming anyone. The association with Marie Antoinette developed much later, largely during the Revolution, when her enemies needed a defining villain quote that efficiently captured royal contempt for ordinary suffering. Historical records from those close to her describe Marie Antoinette as unusually aware of poverty compared to typical court behavior. She regularly donated to charitable causes and reduced her household expenses during grain shortages. The quote stuck because it was perfectly tailored to the revolutionary narrative that was already being constructed around her. A real, nuanced, and contradictory queen was far less useful than a single damning sentence. Marie Antoinette was executed partly on the strength of a reputation built from a quote she almost certainly never said. History handed her the bill for someone else's dinner conversation, and she paid it with her head. 11. The Spanish Inquisition. In popular imagination, the most bloodthirsty theological enforcement apparatus in human history, torturing millions across centuries of religious terror. The actual historical record, drawn from the Inquisition's own surviving archives, tells a considerably different story, and a more complicated one. Historians Henry Charles Lee and Henry Kamen, working from those primary documents, estimated that the Spanish Inquisition executed somewhere between 3,000 and 5,000 people over its roughly 350-year history. That number is real and grim. It is not millions. Torture was permitted but strictly regulated within Inquisition procedures. It could not draw blood, could not be repeated on the same charge, and could not last more than 15 minutes. By the standards of contemporary secular courts operating elsewhere in Europe, this was relatively restrained. Secular courts across Europe during the same period routinely executed more people for witchcraft in single decades than the Inquisition did across its entire existence. The wildly inflated reputation was largely constructed by Protestant England during the late 16th century as anti-Spanish wartime propaganda, a documented phenomenon that historians now call the Black Legend. The Spanish Inquisition became the definitive symbol of religious barbarism, while secular governments were quietly executing 10 times as many people for equivalent offenses. History picked the most dramatic villain and assigned it all the crimes. 12. Poor, primitive, pre-scientific medieval Europeans trudged through their muddy little lives completely convinced the earth beneath them was a flat disk and that the edge was somewhere past France. This is one of the most durable myths in the history of historical myths, and it is entirely false. Medieval scholars, clergy, and educated Europeans broadly accepted a spherical earth as established fact. Thomas Aquinas, the most influential theologian of the medieval period, referenced a spherical earth routinely in his writings without treating it as remotely controversial. Medieval universities in Bologna, Oxford, and Paris taught spherical earth cosmology as foundational curriculum based directly on classical Greek sources that had remained in continuous circulation for centuries. Dante's Divine Comedy, written in the early 14th century and representing the defining cultural document of the medieval world, is structured entirely around a spherical earth with a southern hemisphere. The flat medieval earth myth was largely invented and popularized in the 19th century by writers including John William Draper and Andrew Dixon White, who were deliberately constructing a narrative of religion suppressing science to serve their own contemporary arguments. The myth that medieval people believed in a flat earth was invented by people who wanted to feel scientifically superior to the past. The irony is that the people repeating it haven't fact-checked a claim that has been demonstrably wrong for 200 years. 13. Walt Disney, the man who gave the world animated dreams, is preserved in a frozen chamber somewhere beneath Disneyland, waiting for science to revive him so he can greenlight a sequel. This is completely fabricated. Disney was cremated 4 days after his death in December 1966. He has no frozen body stored anywhere. Disney died on December 15, 1966, from lung cancer and was cremated on December 17th, 2 days after his death, with a private family funeral. The first known human to be cryonically preserved was James Bedford on January 12, 1967, nearly a month after Disney's death and cremation. Disney left no instructions for cryonic preservation in his will, and no records from his family, his studio, or any cryonics organization connect him to the practice in any documented way. The myth's origin is unclear, but appears to have circulated in tabloid publications throughout the late 1960s, and gained momentum through pure repetition without verification. Walt Disney built an empire on stories that felt true even when they weren't. He became the subject of a story that feels true, even though it isn't. His greatest legacy might be a myth about his own death that even his company, with every financial incentive to correct it, cannot seem to kill. 14. Out of the smoke and ash of the Great Fire of London in 1666 comes a silver lining that history has been repeating ever since. The fire conveniently incinerated the plague that had been killing Londoners throughout the previous year, cauterizing the city's epidemic in one dramatic 4-day blaze. The plague was already in steep decline before the first spark. By the time of the Great Fire in September 1666, plague deaths had already dropped from approximately 7,000 per week at the September 1665 peak to dozens per week, a collapse that predated the fire entirely. The fire destroyed approximately 13,200 houses, but burned primarily in the dense commercial city of London, not the poorer outer parishes where most plague deaths had actually occurred. Plague fleas and rats were not exclusively concentrated in the central city. Many of the areas worst affected by plague were completely outside the fire's reach. Historical epidemiologists generally attribute the plague's decline to natural factors: the death of large portions of the susceptible population, possible acquired immunity, and changes in rat populations that had nothing to do with the fire. The Great Fire has been handed credit for ending the plague, the way a bystander gets credit for extinguishing a fire that was already almost out. History loves a dramatic conclusion, even when the conclusion arrived late and accomplished almost nothing. 15. Honest Abe. Principled, morally consistent from the beginning. The great emancipator who spent his career fighting for the abolition of slavery from deep personal conviction. Lincoln's actual position on slavery evolved significantly across his public life, and he stated explicitly on multiple occasions that his primary objective was preserving the Union, not abolishing slavery. In an 1862 letter to newspaper editor Horace Greeley, Lincoln wrote without ambiguity, "If I could save the Union without freeing any slave, I would do it. And if I could save it by freeing all the slaves, I would do that." His early political positions included opposition to black suffrage and social equality. In his 1858 debates with Stephen Douglas, he stated clearly that he did not believe in political or social equality between white and black Americans. The Emancipation Proclamation of 1863 applied only to Confederate states in active rebellion, explicitly exempting border states still in the Union, making it as much a military strategy as a moral declaration. Lincoln's views on racial equality genuinely evolved over his presidency, particularly by 1864 and 65, but presenting him as a consistent lifelong abolitionist erases that documented evolution. Lincoln was extraordinary precisely because he changed. But history prefers statues to people who used to be wrong, so the changing gets left out. 16. The Trojan War's masterstroke, a giant wooden horse stuffed with Greek soldiers, wheeled inside the walls of Troy, and the city falls. The problem begins with the primary source. Homer's Iliad, the foundational text of the entire war narrative, does not actually describe the horse at all. It appears only briefly in the Odyssey and in detail in Virgil's Aeneid, a Roman work composed roughly 700 years after the events it describes. Some classicists have proposed that the wooden horse was a misinterpretation or literary metaphor for a siege engine or battering ram, which were sometimes given animal names in ancient military tradition. A wooden structure used to break gates described in terms that later readers took literally. The city most commonly identified as Troy, excavated at Hisarlik in modern Turkey, shows evidence of violent destruction consistent with the war period. No horse-shaped artifact has been found. Whether a Trojan War occurred in any form resembling the myth is still actively debated by archaeologists and classicists working from the available physical record. One of history's most famous military tactics may be a poetic metaphor that calcified into literal fact over centuries of retelling. The definitive story of ancient deception may itself be a deception, which is either beautiful or deeply inconvenient, depending on how committed you are to the horse. 17. The Black Death. Bubonic plague, spread by filthy medieval rats scurrying through Europe's streets, their fleas jumping onto humans and killing a third of the continent. The rat flea transmission model for Black Death spread is now scientifically contested in ways that most general histories have not caught up with. A 2018 study published in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences modeled the spread of plague across 9 European cities and found that human ectoparasite transmission, body lice and fleas living directly on people rather than on rats, matched historical death rates far more accurately than the rat flea model. The rat flea model requires dense rat populations to collapse rapidly before humans are infected, but historical records do not consistently show mass rat die-offs preceding human outbreaks, which the theory predicts should be visible and was not reliably recorded. DNA evidence from Black Death victims in European cemeteries has confirmed Yersinia pestis as the causative bacterium, but does not specify the transmission vector. The confirmation of what killed people does not resolve the question of how it moved between them. For 6 centuries, the rat has been Europe's most convicted scapegoat for the worst catastrophe in its history. The more likely primary culprit was the humans themselves, which is simultaneously on brand for medieval Europe and deeply unsurprising. 18. The image is permanent. Roman flames. Nero fiddling. The ultimate portrait of detached imperial decadence. You have already heard this one debunked 2 items ago. But here is the version that goes deeper, because the myth has a second layer that is equally instructive. The reason the Nero story spread so effectively was not because Romans were gullible. It was because Nero actually blamed the Christians for the fire, and the Christians, who survived him, outlasted his dynasty, and eventually ran the empire, wrote the history. When a persecuted group inherits the pen, the man who persecuted them tends to get the worst possible version of every disputed event permanently attached to his name. Tacitus, who documented the Christian accusation against Nero alongside Nero's counter-accusation, was writing in an era when Christianity was already socially significant. The fiddling story is not just a factual error. It is a case study in how historical narrative gets constructed by whoever controls the subsequent record. Nero had genuine atrocities to his name that required no embellishment, but the embellishments arrived anyway, because the people writing the account had reasons to make him worse than the evidence supported. The instrument was wrong. The motive for inventing it was not. 19. The apple did not hit Newton in the head. You covered that already. But here is what that myth obscures about how scientific discovery actually functions, which is the part worth being angry about. Newton's gravitational work was not a moment. It was 20 years of mathematics, correspondence, argument, and revision, conducted by a man who was also simultaneously reinventing calculus, conducting optical experiments, and managing a personality so difficult that he nearly destroyed his own legacy through feuds with other scientists. The slapstick apple story exists because human beings are profoundly uncomfortable with the actual explanation for genius, which is obsessive, sustained, unglamorous labor over long periods of time with no guarantee of outcome. A falling piece of fruit is a story anyone can understand in 4 seconds. The actual mechanism, decades of rigorous mathematical development building on centuries of prior astronomical observation, requires attention, patience, and some willingness to sit with complexity. History chose the version that fits in a caption. The version that fits in a caption told you that discovery is accidental, dramatic, and instantaneous. That lesson is incorrect, and the consequences of teaching it to generations of students are significantly larger than the apple myth itself suggests. 20. Marie Antoinette's quote has already been dispatched, but the broader mechanism it represents deserves its own item, because the construction of her villain narrative is one of the most instructive exercises in political myth-making in European history. By the time the revolution needed her to be a symbol, The pamphlet press, which the printing press had made cheap and fast and impossible to regulate effectively, was producing material about her that ranged from the unflattering to the pornographic. Her alleged remark about cake was the respectable end of a propaganda campaign that included fabricated sexual scandals, invented correspondence, and accusations designed to make her not just politically illegitimate, but personally disgusting. She was a foreign woman in a position of enormous visible power during an era of catastrophic economic failure, which made her the ideal receptacle for every anxiety the revolutionary moment needed to externalize. The specific quote is false, but the machinery that made it stick and made it lethal is real, documented, and recognizable. You have seen that machinery operate in your own lifetime, in different contexts, against different targets, using different distribution channels. The technology changes. The technique, find a villain, give them a damning line, repeat until it becomes memory, does not. 21. Galileo was imprisoned, tortured, and martyred by the Catholic Church for daring to say the earth moves around the sun. A story of scientific heroism versus religious oppression that is incomplete in almost every significant detail. Galileo was placed under house arrest, not imprisoned in a dungeon. He was not tortured. He was a practicing Catholic who had supporters within the church hierarchy, including Cardinal Barberini, who later became Pope Urban VIII, the same pope who eventually ordered his trial. The conflict was as much personal and political as it was theological. Galileo had published a dialogue in which one character defending the church's geocentric position was named Simplicio, a name with obvious implications, and Urban VIII believed the character was based on him. The church's actual position on heliocentrism was more nuanced than simple flat rejection. The Copernican model had been discussed within church intellectual circles for decades before Galileo's condemnation. The science versus religion framing was substantially constructed by 19th century writers, building the same narrative that invented the flat earth medieval myth. Galileo's actual situation was a brilliant, politically careless man who insulted the wrong powerful person at the wrong historical moment. The telescope was involved. So was an unfortunate character name. The martyrdom story requires leaving out the Simplicio detail. 22. Julius Caesar was born by the surgical procedure that carries his name. The origin story writes itself so perfectly that most people never stop to question it. Caesar's mother, Aurelia Cotta, lived until Caesar was in his 40s. She was actively involved in his education and political career, and died around 54 BC, roughly 46 years after his birth. Caesarean sections in the ancient world were performed only on mothers who had already died, as a last attempt to save the child. Performing such a procedure on a living woman was not a survivable medical option in the ancient world. If Aurelia had undergone the procedure, she would not have been alive to raise him. The word Caesarean more likely derives from the Latin verb caedere, meaning to cut, making the naming connection circular and almost certainly coincidental rather than biographical. Pliny the Elder makes a reference to an ancestor of Caesar being cut from the womb, a story of unclear origin that may have seeded the association. Caesar was not born by the procedure named after him. The procedure was not named after him, and yet the story is so elegant that correcting it feels almost rude, which is precisely how the most durable myths survive. 23. Cleopatra is Egypt's most iconic ruler, the embodiment of ancient North African civilization, her image carved into the cultural memory of the Western world as definitively Egyptian. Cleopatra VII was almost certainly of Macedonian Greek descent. A member of the Ptolemaic dynasty, founded by Ptolemy I Soter, one of Alexander the Great's generals, approximately 275 years before her birth. Her family had ruled Egypt for generations, while maintaining Macedonian Greek cultural identity so thoroughly that Cleopatra was notably unusual within her own dynasty, precisely because she bothered to learn the Egyptian language. She was the first Ptolemaic ruler in centuries to do so. Her predecessors conducted court business entirely in Greek. Her primary cultural affiliations were Hellenistic. She presented herself as the goddess Isis for Egyptian audiences, but conducted all her diplomacy within Greco-Roman frameworks, in languages that were not Egyptian. She was, in the most accurate available description, a Greek-speaking Macedonian administrator who learned the local language as a management strategy. This does not diminish her extraordinary political intelligence or her historical significance. It simply means that Egypt's most famous queen was, in ethnic and cultural terms, not Egyptian in any straightforward sense. The marketing has survived better than the biographical accuracy. 24. The samurai code of Bushido is ancient, timeless, and unchanging. The eternal soul of Japanese martial culture, passed down through centuries of warrior tradition without significant alteration. Bushido, as a formal written philosophical code, was largely systematized in the late 17th century, long after the most active samurai period had passed, and the version you recognize was substantially reconstructed during the Meiji era for explicitly nationalist purposes. The most cited Bushido text, the Hagakure by Yamamoto Tsunetomo, was dictated between 1709 and 1716, a period of prolonged peace, during which samurai had almost no wars to fight. It is a retrospective romanticization, written by someone who had never experienced the battlefield conditions it describes, which makes it philosophy rather than field manual. The book most responsible for Western understanding of Bushido, Nitobe Inazo's 1900 work, titled Bushido, The Soul of Japan, was written in English for Western audiences by a Meiji-era diplomat who wanted to explain Japan to foreigners in terms they would find admirable. Historical samurai behavior across the 12th through 16th centuries included betrayal, opportunistic alliance switching, and conduct that would horrify anyone expecting a rigid honor code. The code was written after the people it described were already obsolete. Ancient traditions frequently are. 25. The stock market crashes on Black Tuesday in October 1929, and desperate ruined investors throw themselves from Wall Street windows in waves, the human cost of financial catastrophe playing out on the sidewalks below. Suicide rates in October and November 1929 were not statistically elevated. The New York City mortality data does not show a spike during or immediately after the crash. Historian John Kenneth Galbraith noted in his detailed study of the period that the suicide wave was a well-embroidered myth, with newspapers sometimes combining reports of entirely unrelated deaths into crash narratives that served the dramatic story the moment seemed to demand. Eddie Cantor, a popular comedian of the era, made jokes about crash-related suicides in his 1929 and 30 performances, both reflecting and amplifying a public perception that had already outrun the documented reality. Suicide rates did rise during the Great Depression, but during the sustained economic hardship of 1930 through 33, not in the immediate aftermath of the market crash itself. The most dramatic human image associated with the 1929 crash was largely a story people told rather than an event they witnessed. Even the Great Depression's opening chapter was partially constructed from narrative rather than news, which is either remarkable or entirely predictable depending on how much history you have read. 26. Pirates made captives walk the plank. It is the classic maritime punishment, a blindfolded figure shuffling above shark-filled water, poked forward by a cutlass until gravity completes the sentence. Walking the plank appears in almost no verified historical record of actual piracy. The earliest known literary reference to the practice appears in a 1788 novel, nearly a century after the so-called Golden Age of piracy ended. Actual historical piracy records document executions by hanging, keel-hauling, marooning, and simple shooting, all well documented in court records and contemporary accounts. Plank walking appears in essentially none of the extensive historical trial records of captured pirates, which are remarkably detailed sources given how aggressively European navies prosecuted piracy during the period. The image was massively popularized by J.M. Barrie's Peter Pan, Robert Louis Stevenson's Treasure Island, and various theatrical productions of the 19th century, all of which were written by people who had access to the historical record and chose the more entertaining option. Real pirates had little theatrical incentive for elaborate executions. Efficiency was more operationally useful than drama when you were trying to manage a stolen ship with a small crew. History chose the version that sells more Halloween costumes. The actual pirates would have found the romanticism puzzling and the inefficiency professionally embarrassing. 27-4-76 AD. The last Roman emperor in the West is deposed. The curtain falls on Rome. Civilization retreats, and the Dark Ages begin. Clean, decisive, and historically teachable in a single sentence. The Eastern Roman Empire, centered in Constantinople, continued operating, thriving, and calling itself Rome for another 1,000 years, until 1453 AD, when Ottoman forces under Sultan Mehmed II finally took the city. The fall of Rome in 476 was the fall of one administrative district, not a civilization. Even the 476 date is somewhat arbitrary. The Western Empire had been fragmenting for decades, with multiple emperors, competing power centers, and barbarian kingdoms operating within nominal imperial territory long before that year. The deposition of Romulus Augustulus was so anticlimactic that Odoacer, who deposed him, did not bother claiming the title of emperor. He simply ruled as king and sent a polite notification to Constantinople. Roman law, Roman administrative structures, the Latin language, and Roman church infrastructure continued operating throughout the medieval West, regardless of who held political power over specific territories. The fall of Rome is history's most famous ending, and it did not actually end. Half of it kept running for another millennium, and was simply excluded from Western textbooks at a certain point because the narrative needed a conclusion. 28. The Iron Maiden, a woman-shaped iron cabinet lined with interior spikes, sealing the condemned inside for a slow and agonizing death, the ultimate symbol of medieval brutality, and the go-to exhibit for anyone trying to communicate how terrible the past was. There is no verified historical evidence that Iron Maidens were used as torture devices during the medieval period. The most famous example, the Iron Maiden of Nuremberg, was assembled from unrelated medieval artifacts in the early 19th century, specifically for museum exhibition. Essentially a tourist attraction prop constructed from spare parts collected across different eras and contexts. Medieval torture devices are extensively documented in contemporary legal and ecclesiastical records. Iron Maidens do not appear in these records, despite the thorough documentation of other instruments that were actually used. The appetite for these artifacts coincided precisely with the 19th century's romanticized fascination with a dark medieval past, creating a market for dramatic antiquities that collectors and exhibitors were happy to supply by any means necessary. The medieval period was brutal enough to not require fictional props. History nevertheless preferred the ones that looked impressive in a glass case and confirmed what paying visitors already believed about how terrible everything used to be before the present arrived to improve matters. 29. Gladiators clash in the Roman Colosseum until one falls. The crowd roars, the emperor's thumb turns, and the defeated man's throat is cut. Every match a lethal spectacle, every bout a fight to the death. Most gladiatorial matches were not fought to the death, because gladiators were extraordinarily expensive investments, and killing one per match would have been financially ruinous by any accounting available to a Roman arena owner. Training a gladiator took years and cost the equivalent of purchasing multiple enslaved people. Losing a trained fighter every match was economically comparable to destroying a racing thoroughbred after every race. Archaeological and historical evidence suggests that many matches ended with the defeat and submission of one fighter, followed by a crowd appeal and the event organizer's decision on whether to spare or execute the fallen combatant. And sparing was frequently the choice. Estimates from skeletal analysis of gladiator burial sites suggest that a given gladiator might die in roughly 1 in 5 or 6 career matches. A significant occupational risk, but not certain death per encounter. The thumbs down gesture itself is historically misrepresented. The actual crowd signal for death may have been a closed fist or an entirely different gesture. The arena had more in common with professional athletics than with a slaughterhouse, which is not a comfortable sentence, but it is the accurate one. 30. George Washington had wooden teeth. It is the most enduring physical detail attached to the father of the nation. The tactile fact that makes him feel human and slightly absurd, which is probably why it has lasted. Washington's dentures were never wood. They were made from combinations of human teeth, animal teeth, ivory, and metal. Extraordinarily unpleasant in every possible respect, but never wood. Washington suffered severe dental problems throughout his adult life, losing teeth from a young age, and by his first presidential inauguration in 1789, he had only one natural tooth remaining. His surviving dentures, several sets of which are preserved in museums, are constructed from hippopotamus ivory, elephant ivory, cow teeth, and human teeth that were possibly purchased from enslaved people at Mount Vernon, a detail that significantly complicates the charming folk history version. Wood would have been an entirely impractical material for dentures. Porous, prone to absorbing saliva, prone to staining, and structurally inadequate for chewing. No dentist of the period would have used it for a patient of any means. The wooden teeth myth may have originated from ivory dentures staining over time to a wood-like appearance. The man on the $1 bill had dentures made partly from other people's extracted teeth, which is considerably more disturbing than wood, which is possibly why history chose the more comfortable explanation and kept it there. 31. The Mongols poured from the steppes and annihilated every civilization in their path, leaving only rubble and terror behind them. Pure destruction with no cultural contribution. History's most thorough demolition crew wearing human faces. The Mongol Empire created the largest contiguous land empire in history and established trade networks, legal codes, religious tolerance policies, and administrative systems that shaped Eurasia for centuries in directions that the pure destroyer narrative cannot accommodate. The Pax Mongolica, running approximately from 1250 to 1350, enabled safe trade and communication across the entire breadth of Asia, directly facilitating the Silk Road traffic that transmitted technology, culture, and goods between East and West at a scale previously impossible. Kublai Khan's Yuan dynasty in China patronized arts, science, and commerce extensively. Genghis Khan promulgated a law code that included religious freedom provisions unprecedented in the region. He personally exempted clergy of all religions from taxation and conscription, a tolerance policy that predates most European equivalents by centuries. The Black Death's transmission to Europe via the Silk Road was an unintended consequence of the same interconnected networks the Mongol Empire built, demonstrating that their influence, for good and for catastrophic ill, was profound in both directions. The most destructive empire in history built the road that shaped the modern world. Both things are true simultaneously. 32. The Titanic was declared unsinkable before its maiden voyage. The ultimate hubris. The arrogance of industrial civilization tempting fate. The pride that preceded the most famous maritime disaster in history. White Star Line never officially declared the Titanic unsinkable in their promotional materials. The word appeared once in a single article in the Shipbuilder Trade Journal in 1911, describing the ship's watertight compartment design as making it practically unsinkable, a qualified technical statement written for a specialist audience, not a marketing claim printed on a ticket. White Star Line's actual advertising for the maiden voyage focused on luxury and scale, not invincibility. The promotional materials do not prominently feature safety claims of any kind. After the disaster, journalists and public commentators needed a narrative explaining how something so magnificent could fail so completely, and they said it was unsinkable, provided a satisfying arc of hubris and nemesis that was retrospectively attached to whatever mild statements existed in the pre-voyage record. The ship's real failures were systemic: insufficient lifeboat capacity, inadequate emergency procedures, and a vessel moving too fast through waters known to contain ice. The hubris was not in anyone's mouth. It was in the regulations, the schedules, and the structural assumptions of the entire maritime industry. The myth is a better story. The truth is a considerably more useful lesson. 33. The First World War erupted because Gavrilo Princip fired 2 shots in Sarajevo on June 28, 1914, and the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand ignited a conflict that killed 17 million people. The assassination was a trigger. It was not a cause. Europe had spent decades constructing a network of alliances, mobilization plans, imperial rivalries, and nationalist pressures so tightly wound that almost any significant incident would have produced a comparable escalation. Germany's Schlieffen Plan, designed to fight a two-front war against France and Russia simultaneously, required rapid mobilization and immediate offensive action the moment war was declared, structurally removing diplomatic flexibility from the moment any crisis began. The alliance system connecting Austria-Hungary, Germany, Russia, France, and Britain created a chain where any regional conflict automatically risked continental escalation, a structural problem that predated the assassination by decades of deliberate treaty construction. The Balkans had already experienced 2 regional wars in 1912 and 13 that nearly triggered continental conflict before Princip loaded his weapon, demonstrating the region's existing volatility without any assistance from him. Historians, including Christopher Clark, have argued that multiple great powers made specific decisions in the summer of 1914 that escalated rather than contained the crisis. Blaming the war on a single gunshot is like blaming a house fire on the match, while ignoring that someone spent 30 years filling every room with the material that made it possible. 34. Einstein's connection to the atomic bomb is one of history's most consequential misattributions. The theoretical physicist who unlocked the universe inevitably linked to the weapon that most dramatically demonstrated how dangerous unlocking the universe could be. Einstein was explicitly excluded from the Manhattan Project. The U.S. Army denied him security clearance, considering him a potential risk due to his pacifist and socialist associations, which meant the man whose name is synonymous with the bomb was legally prohibited from contributing to it. The Einstein-Szilard Letter of 1939, which Einstein signed and which warned President Roosevelt about the possibility of nuclear weapons, was largely drafted by physicist Leo Szilard. Einstein's role was lending his famous name to a warning he did not compose. He later said that signing it was the one great mistake of his life. E equals mc squared does establish the mass-energy equivalence that underlies nuclear physics. But the engineering, chemistry, and physics of actually building a functional weapon required entirely separate bodies of work carried out by hundreds of scientists, including Oppenheimer, Fermi, and Bohr, none of whom needed Einstein's direct participation to proceed. Einstein spent the post-war period advocating for nuclear disarmament. His connection to the bomb is like crediting the inventor of the internal combustion engine for a specific collision. The theoretical foundation existed. The people who built the weapon made their own decisions, without his participation and without his approval. 35. The Colosseum was purpose-built for gladiatorial combat. The definitive Roman arena where trained fighters clashed before roaring crowds in the defining entertainment experience of the ancient world. Gladiatorial combat, while certainly part of its programming, was only one category among many. The inaugural games held in 80 AD under Emperor Titus lasted 100 days, and reportedly included the deaths of 9,000 animals in elaborate venations, staged animal hunts, not exclusively human combat, The arena floor could apparently be flooded for naumachii, mock naval battles, though historians debate the engineering feasibility of this after the underground hypogeum structure was added. Public executions were staged as elaborate mythological reenactments, a form of execution as theater designed for mass audiences who wanted their state violence to have narrative shape. The Colosseum was closed as an entertainment venue in the 6th century AD, then used subsequently as housing, a fortress, a cemetery, and a Christian shrine before becoming a quarry for building materials during the medieval and Renaissance periods. A repurposing history that suggests the Romans and their successors were considerably more pragmatic about the building than the legend implies. Calling it a gladiatorial venue is accurate the same way calling a shopping mall a food court is accurate. Technically true, wildly incomplete. The building contained multitudes, most of which the popular imagination has quietly discarded. 36 medieval people lived only to age 35 on average. Brutal, short lives ground down by disease, violence, and a chronic shortage of basic sanitation, barely reaching middle age before the medieval world finished them off. The average lifespan of 35 figure includes catastrophically high infant and child mortality rates, which were extraordinarily elevated in the medieval period. When those deaths are averaged into life expectancy at birth, the number drops dramatically. But this does not reflect how long surviving adults actually lived, which is the number people are implying when they repeat the statistic at dinner parties. Life expectancy at age 21 in medieval England was approximately 43 additional years, meaning a 21-year-old who had survived childhood could expect to live to roughly 64. Not dramatically shorter than pre-antibiotic modern populations facing comparable infectious disease environments. Historical records show numerous medieval individuals living into their 70s and beyond. Geoffrey Chaucer lived to approximately 60, Eleanor of Aquitaine to approximately 80, Pope Gregory Nunn reportedly into his late 90s. The high infant mortality was driven by infectious disease, malnutrition during vulnerable early years, and the particular dangers of childbirth, not by some universal principle that adults aged and died faster than people in other eras. The medieval lifespan statistic measures childhood death, not adult aging, and conflating the two has been misleading people about the past for generations. 37. Adolf Hitler was Austrian, not German, a distinction people deploy as though national origin dissolves historical responsibility, or as though the birthplace changes anything about the trajectory of the 20th century. Hitler was born in Braunau am Inn, Austria, in 1889, and remained a citizen of Austria for most of his early life. He renounced his Austrian citizenship in 1925, leaving him technically stateless for several years. German citizenship was granted in 1932 by the state of Brunswick, a political maneuver arranged specifically to allow him to run for German public office, making his German citizenship an instrumental acquisition rather than a birthright. He identified as ethnically German throughout his entire life, and built his complete political identity on pan-German nationalism, the ideology that all German-speaking peoples should be unified under a single state. Austria's attempt after World War II to portray itself as Hitler's first victim was a deliberate national narrative that obscured substantial Austrian enthusiasm for the Anschluss of 1938 and significant Austrian participation in Nazi crimes at every level of the apparatus. This Austrian victim myth was officially revised in the 1980s and 90s as Austrian historians documented the country's active collaboration with the regime. The nationality distinction changes nothing about what happened. It was constructed specifically to change how much responsibility certain people felt obligated to accept for what happened. 38. The Library of Alexandria burned in a single catastrophic fire. One night of flame destroyed the accumulated knowledge of the ancient world, setting human civilization back by centuries in a single devastating event. The Library of Alexandria declined gradually over several centuries through funding cuts, political neglect, and multiple partial destructions, none of which constituted a single catastrophic end. Julius Caesar's fire during his siege of Alexandria in 48 BC damaged warehouses near the harbor, possibly containing books stored for export, but did not destroy the main library, which continued operating afterward. The library likely declined significantly under Roman rule through reduced royal funding. The Ptolemaic kings who had lavishly financed it were gone, and Roman imperial priorities were different. The institution was probably a diminished shadow of its height long before any physical destruction occurred. Theophilus, the Christian bishop of Alexandria, destroyed the Serapeum, a secondary library site, in 391 AD, a real destruction event, but not the definitive end of the library as an institution. The Arab conquest of Alexandria in 642 AD was later blamed for destroying the library by Crusader-era writers with obvious political motivations, but most historians believe the institution was already effectively defunct long before this date. The greatest library in the ancient world was not destroyed in a single dramatic fire. It was defunded, neglected, and allowed to diminish over centuries, which is both less cinematic and significantly more recognizable as a pattern. 39. King Canute of England sat at the water's edge, commanding the tide to stop, and was humiliated when the tide ignored him. The definitive image of royal arrogance, the ruler who confused his own power with the power of nature. Canute staged the tidal demonstration deliberately to make the opposite point. According to Henry of Huntingdon's Historia Anglorum, written approximately a century after Canute's death, Canute had his throne carried to the shore, specifically to rebuke courtiers who were telling him his power was absolute and unlimited. He wanted to demonstrate they were wrong. After the tide came in and wet his feet, as he knew it would, because he understood how tides function, Canute reportedly declared that no earthly king deserved the title Great and never wore his crown again, hanging it instead on a crucifix as an act of deliberate humility. The story was subsequently retold with the lesson completely inverted, transforming a demonstration of royal self-awareness into a demonstration of royal stupidity over approximately 800 years of increasingly careless retelling. Canute's most famous act was a lesson about the limits of power, and history repaid him by demonstrating that lesson again, this time by getting the entire story backwards. He was making a point about humility. We remembered him as the punchline of a joke he was specifically trying to prevent. 40. No one was burned at the stake during the Salem witch trials, the defining American image of religious hysteria and mass persecution culminating in flames and screaming crowds. 19 people were hanged. One man was pressed to death under heavy stones over the course of 2 days when he refused to enter a plea. Several others died in prison, awaiting trial that never came. No one was burned. The Salem witch trials of 1692 and 93 resulted in executions by hanging at a location now identified as Proctor's Ledge in Salem, not at Gallows Hill, as commonly named in popular accounts. One man, Giles Corey, was pressed to death under rocks placed on a board laid across his body, a process that took 2 days because he refused to enter a plea that would allow the court to seize his family's property, regardless of verdict. Burning at the stake was the common execution method for witchcraft in continental Europe and in Scotland. But New England's legal tradition followed English common law, which prescribed hanging for capital offenses. The confusion between Salem and European witch trial methods appears to have developed through a conflation of the Salem trials with the broader continental tradition in popular culture and theatrical representation. Salem's victims deserve to be remembered accurately. History gave them someone else's execution method from a different continent for reasons that appear to be purely dramatic convenience. 41. Marco Polo returned from China in 1295 with noodles in his bags, and Italy's culinary destiny was permanently altered. One explorer importing the foundation of Western cuisine across 10,000 miles of Silk Road. Pasta in Italy predates Marco Polo's return by documented decades. A 1154 document by Arab geographer Muhammad al-Idrisi describes a flour and water product made in Sicily that was shipped in significant quantities to other regions, nearly 140 years before Polo came home. A 1279 Genoese document records the estate inventory of a soldier who died before Marco Polo's departure for China, which includes a basket of macaroni among the listed possessions. The Marco Polo pasta origin story appears in its fully developed modern form in an article in the Macaroni Journal, published by an American Pasta Industry Trade Association in 1929. Clearly a promotional narrative rather than historical documentation, written to help Americans feel culturally connected to a food they were consuming in increasing quantities. Both Italian and Chinese noodle traditions likely developed independently as similar solutions to similar culinary problems in different regions, without requiring a single transmission event or a specific carrier. The story of Marco Polo importing pasta was invented by an American trade magazine to sell more pasta. Italy's most celebrated culinary export was given a fictional backstory by people who had never been to Italy. It worked extraordinarily well, and the correction has not. 42. The Emancipation Proclamation freed all American slaves. January 1st, 1863. Lincoln signs the document, and slavery in America ends with a stroke of a pen, a moral reckoning, a nation transformed in a single legal moment. The Emancipation Proclamation freed enslaved people only in Confederate states in active rebellion against the Union, and it explicitly exempted enslaved people in Union-loyal border states and Union-occupied Confederate territories, where the federal government actually had enforcement authority. The proclamation explicitly exempted several parishes in Louisiana, including New Orleans, then under Union control, certain counties in Virginia, and all of the border states, Kentucky, Missouri, Maryland, and Delaware, that had not seceded from the Union. As a war powers measure, it applied where Lincoln claimed Confederate states had forfeited their legal rights, meaning it theoretically freed people in places where the Union had no practical ability to enforce that freedom, while leaving untouched the approximately 800,000 enslaved people in areas the Union actually controlled. Slavery was not legally abolished throughout the United States until the 13th Amendment was ratified on December 6, 1865, more than 2 years after the proclamation. The document celebrated as the legal end of American slavery specifically excluded the places where the issuing government had the authority to enforce it. Both things, the proclamation's genuine significance and its extraordinary limitations, are true simultaneously, and presenting only the first one is a choice with consequences. 43. A penny dropped from the top of the Empire State Building will punch straight through a skull on the sidewalk below. A cautionary tale about physics and loose change that has been repeated by physics teachers and nervous tourists for generations. A penny dropped from that height would reach a terminal velocity of roughly 25 miles per hour, which is unpleasant if it struck you, but nowhere near lethal, and the penny is extremely unlikely to travel in a straight vertical line regardless. A penny is an aerodynamically inefficient object, flat, lightweight at 2.5 grams, and prone to tumbling and spinning as it falls. This tumbling dramatically increases air resistance and reduces terminal velocity far below what a streamlined falling object would achieve. Physicist Louis Bloomfield of the University of Virginia tested this using a penny firing device and confirmed the relatively low impact force the terminal velocity produces. The real danger of objects dropped from skyscrapers involves denser, heavier, and more aerodynamically coherent items, bolts, tools, or construction debris, not currency. The penny from a skyscraper story has been used to teach children about physics for decades, and the physics lesson it teaches is wrong. The real lesson is that a penny is too light and too badly shaped to kill anything, which is considerably less dramatic, but considerably more accurate. You have been frightened by a coin for no valid scientific reason. 44. Catherine the Great of Russia died in a spectacular and compromising incident involving a horse being lowered by a harness. A story so outrageously specific that generations of people have assumed it must contain some grain of documented truth. Catherine the Great died of a stroke on November 17th, 1796. She was found unconscious in her private chambers at the Winter Palace and died the following day. No horse was involved in any capacity. Contemporary accounts from her personal physician and court attendants consistently record a cerebral hemorrhage and a straightforward death in her private rooms. The horse story appears to have been deliberate political propaganda circulated by her enemies, both foreign powers who resented her territorial expansion and internal political opponents who found it more effective to destroy her reputation than to challenge her policies directly. Catherine's actual historical record includes expanding the Russian Empire significantly, reforming its legal code, corresponding with Voltaire and Diderot as intellectual equals, and ruling with considerable effectiveness for 34 years, achievements that her enemies preferred to obscure behind sexual slander that required no evidence to spread and no evidence to refute. Similar degrading stories were routinely fabricated about powerful women throughout European history as tools of political character assassination. Catherine ruled an empire for 3.5 decades, and the single fact most people know about her is an invented story about her death. The most effective weapon against a powerful woman has historically been a sufficiently disgusting rumor, repeated often enough that correction feels beside the point. 45. Machiavelli advocated for pure evil and ruthlessness in politics. The philosopher of amoral manipulation, the man who gave cynical power a guidebook, the original villain of Western political thought whose name became an adjective for calculated cruelty. The Prince was likely a descriptive or satirical work about political reality, rather than a prescriptive manual for evil, and Machiavelli's broader body of work consistently argues for republican government and civic virtue in terms that directly contradict the cartoon villain reading. His longer and more carefully developed work, The Discourses on Livy, explicitly advocates for republican government, popular participation, and civic virtue, positions that make no sense from someone who genuinely believed amoral ruthlessness was the correct framework for governance. Many scholars, including Quentin Skinner and Isaiah Berlin, have argued the Prince was descriptive rather than prescriptive. Here's what rulers actually do to maintain power, observed without endorsement, and possibly ironic in ways that a decontextualized reading cannot detect. Machiavelli was a committed Florentine Republican who was imprisoned and tortured by the Medici after they returned to power, which is not the biography of someone who enthusiastically endorsed authoritarian rule from personal conviction. The Prince was written in 1513 partially as a job application to the Medici rulers who had just had him arrested, which makes its contents strategically motivated. History extracted the most readable chapter and ignored everything else he wrote and everything that happened to him personally. The adjective outlasted the context that would have complicated it. 46. The American Wild West was a lawless shooting gallery where every town was a powder keg, every saloon a gunfight waiting to happen, and frontier justice was delivered at 30 paces on dusty streets by men who were always armed and never patient. Statistical and historical analysis shows that most frontier towns were remarkably orderly environments with low homicide rates, functioning legal systems, and in many cases strict gun control ordinances that the mythology has thoroughly erased. Historian Robert Dijkstra's detailed statistical analysis of Kansas cattle towns found that Dodge City averaged only 1.5 homicides per year during its most violent decade, a rate lower than many contemporary American cities, and dramatically lower than the body count suggested by any given Western film set there. Many frontier towns, including Dodge City and Tombstone, enforced strict ordinances requiring visitors to check their weapons upon entering town, a fact that directly contradicts the armed at all times mythology at the core of the genre. The Wyatt Earp gunfight at the OK Corral in 1881 lasted approximately 30 seconds, involved 9 people total, and produced 3 deaths. Remembered as a defining moment of frontier violence, precisely because such events were uncommon enough to be remarkable and worth reporting. The Wild West mythology was substantially constructed by dime novelists, Buffalo Bill's traveling show, and later Hollywood, all of whom amplified the frequency and intensity of frontier violence for audiences who wanted the excitement without the actual boredom of frontier life. The most lawless region in American mythology was enforcing gun ordinances, while novelists wrote about how no one was enforcing anything. 47. Nikola Tesla died penniless and forgotten. History's greatest unacknowledged genius, erased by corporate suppression, robbed of credit and money by lesser men, dying in total obscurity in a New York hotel room while the world he had electrified went on without him. Tesla died in genuine financial difficulty, but he was far from unacknowledged during his lifetime, and his financial problems were substantially the product of his own choices rather than pure corporate suppression. He was awarded the Edison Medal by the American Institute of Electrical Engineers in 1917, the highest honor in the American electrical engineering field, named after his rival, which is an irony that history has not adequately appreciated. Tesla's financial difficulties stemmed largely from his decisions to fund increasingly speculative later projects, including Wardenclyffe Tower, by spending money he did not have on ventures that did not produce usable results. He lived at the Hotel New Yorker for the last decade of his life, with his expenses ultimately covered by Westinghouse Corporation in recognition of his earlier contributions, not entirely abandoned by the industry he had helped build. His later theories about wireless power transmission on a global scale were not suppressed by corporate enemies. They were underfunded because they were speculative and unproven, which is a different problem with a different cause and a different moral. Tesla was genuinely extraordinary and genuinely struggled. He was not a secret kept from the world. The myth of his total erasure requires ignoring the metal sitting in his hotel room. 48. The Cold War never came close to actual nuclear exchange. Two rational superpowers stared at each other across an ideological divide. Mutually assured destruction kept everyone sensible, and the standoff resolved peacefully, because the system worked as designed. The world came extraordinarily close to accidental nuclear war on multiple documented occasions, and the peaceful outcome was not entirely a triumph of rational deterrence. On September 26, 1983, Soviet Lieutenant Colonel Stanislav Petrov received automated alerts indicating 5 American intercontinental ballistic missiles were inbound. Protocol required him to report this as a confirmed attack, triggering Soviet retaliatory response. He unilaterally decided it was a false alarm, correctly, as it turned out to be a satellite malfunction, and did not report it upward. During the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962, a Soviet submarine near the American blockade zone had lost communication, was under depth charge attack from American forces, and carried a nuclear torpedo with authorization to use it. Launching required the unanimous agreement of 3 officers. One officer, Vasily Arkhipov, refused, and the torpedo was not fired. The Able Archer 83 exercise in November of that same year, a NATO nuclear war simulation, was interpreted by Soviet intelligence as potentially a real first strike preparation, bringing Soviet nuclear forces to heightened alert with weapons in readied states. The Cold War's peaceful conclusion was partly a triumph of policy, and partly the product of individual humans making correct judgment calls against protocol at the exact right moment. The system did not save the world. Specific people saved the world. That is a different and considerably less comfortable lesson. 49. Christopher Columbus was the first European to reach the Americas. 1492. The Ocean Blue, the foundational date of Western engagement with the New World, the voyage that changed everything. Norse explorer Leif Erikson established a settlement at L'Anse aux Meadows in northern Newfoundland approximately 500 years before Columbus's voyage, around 1000 AD, a fact confirmed not by saga literature alone, but by direct archaeological excavation. Lonso Meadows was excavated beginning in 1960 by Norwegian archaeologists Helge and Anne Stein Ingstad and confirmed as a Norse settlement dating to approximately 1000 AD. The site matches numerous elements described in the Norse sagas documenting Leif Eriksson's voyage to a place called Vinland. The settlement was apparently abandoned rather than developed into sustained colonization, which is why it disappeared from subsequent European consciousness and why Columbus's voyage had the world-altering consequences that Eriksson's did not. Jane's All the World's Aircraft, a leading reference publication, formally recognized Gustav Whitehead's possible earlier powered flight claim in 2013, demonstrating that first designations in history are frequently more contested than the clean dates taught in classrooms suggest. Columbus deserves credit for the contact that permanently changed world history. He does not deserve credit for being first to arrive on a continent that millions of people already inhabited, and that at least one European had visited 5 centuries earlier. The holiday celebrates the wrong superlative. 50. The Industrial Revolution was purely a story of progress. Machines conquered drudgery, productivity exploded, and the modern world was born in British mills and factories in an upward trajectory of human improvement that continues to the present day. For the working population directly experiencing the early Industrial Revolution, roughly from 1760 to 1840, measurable living standards, health outcomes, and working conditions frequently worsened before they improved, and the gains went almost entirely to the people who owned the machines rather than the people who operated them. Historian Robert Allen and others working on what economists call the Engels pause have shown that real wages in Britain stagnated or declined for approximately the first 60 to 80 years of industrial growth, while productivity and GDP rose substantially, meaning the economic gains of industrialization were captured by capital owners during the period when the human cost was highest. Child labor in industrial factories was significantly more dangerous and more sustained than pre-industrial agricultural child labor. Children as young as 5 worked 12 to 16-hour days in cotton mills, mines, and other industrial settings in conditions with measurably high mortality rates. Urban mortality in industrial cities like Manchester in the 1840s was catastrophically elevated. Life expectancy at birth in Manchester during that decade was approximately 28 years, lower than in the rural areas people had left to find work. The Industrial Revolution produced enormous long-term gains for human civilization and ground several generations of children into factories to do it. Progress is real. The version that omits who paid for it is a story told by the people who collected the payment. 51. The printing press was invented in the 1440s. Books flooded Europe. Literacy exploded, and the medieval darkness lifted almost immediately in a cascade of democratized knowledge that ushered in the modern age. The printing press's first mass-produced content was largely religious propaganda, astrological almanacs, and papal indulgences. Literally printed certificates sold by the Catholic Church to reduce time in purgatory, making the first commercially successful application of the technology a tool of institutional religious commerce, rather than enlightenment. European literacy rates remained below 20% in most regions well into the 17th century, meaning the explosion of printed material was largely consumed by the same educated minority that had previously accessed handwritten manuscripts. The press's most immediate and dramatic cultural impact was arguably destabilizing rather than enlightening. It enabled the rapid spread of Martin Luther's 95 Theses, triggering the Reformation and approximately 130 years of religiously motivated warfare across Europe that killed millions. The Index of Forbidden Books was itself a product of the printing press era. The Church's systematic response to mass distribution of ideas was mass censorship, not immediate acceptance of the marketplace of ideas. The printing press democratized information the same way a later communications technology democratized information. The first things that spread fastest were misinformation, religious controversy, and commercial exploitation. 5 centuries apart, the pattern is functionally identical, which should either comfort you considerably or alarm you considerably depending on how optimistic you are about the long arc. 52. Gandhi was a universally peaceful, saintly figure whose moral record is as unblemished as his public image, the embodiment of nonviolent resistance and universal compassion, a saint in political clothing whose historical reputation requires no qualification. Gandhi's actual record includes documented racism toward black Africans during his South Africa years, troubling positions on caste, and personal practices that serious historians consider deeply problematic. During his years in South Africa, from 1893 to 1914, Gandhi repeatedly wrote and petitioned against black Africans being housed with Indians in prisons, describing black Africans in terms that are unambiguously racist by any standard applied consistently across historical figures. South African scholars and activists have formally raised these concerns, and they have not been adequately integrated into the Western popular image. Gandhi's attitude toward the caste system was inconsistent. While he opposed untouchability, he for much of his life defended the Varna system of caste divisions as having scientific basis, a position he only partially revised late in life. Gandhi's brahmacharya experiments, in which he slept without clothing beside young women, including his great-niece, to test his celibacy, have been documented by historians, including Ramachandra Guha, and are considered exploitative by many scholars working from the primary sources. The Gandhi presented in Western popular culture is substantially a post-independence construction, a compressed moral icon stripped of contradictions that Indian scholars have documented for decades. He earned the historical significance. The halo was added afterward by people who needed a simpler story. 53. 1776. A united colonial population rises against British tyranny, rallying behind liberty and self-determination in a broadly shared revolutionary cause that speaks for the will of the people it claims to represent. Historians estimate that roughly one-third of colonists actively supported independence, one-third remained loyal to Britain, and one-third were neutral or indifferent, making the American Revolution a civil war as much as an anti-colonial uprising, a fact that complicates the unanimous fervor narrative considerably. John Adams estimated in 1815 that approximately one-third of colonists were patriots, one-third were loyalists, and one-third were neutral, a breakdown that modern historians broadly support based on independent evidence. Approximately 60,000 to 80,000 loyalists fled the colonies during and after the Revolution, many to Canada, Britain, or the Caribbean, a refugee exodus comparable in proportion to many modern political upheavals, representing people whose experience of the Revolution was loss rather than liberation. The Revolution was actively opposed by most Native American nations, who correctly predicted that a British defeat would remove the Royal Proclamation of 1763's protection of their territorial boundaries. Loyalists were subjected to mob violence, property confiscation, imprisonment, and forced exile, behaviors that do not suggest a movement confident in its popular majority. The founding story of the world's most prominent democracy was supported by roughly a third of the people it claimed to represent. Built on the labor of people who were not asked, and written by the winning third, democracy's origin story has always been more complicated than its anniversary celebrations suggest. 54. Early Coca-Cola contained actual cocaine, explaining both its name and its extraordinary early popularity. A legal drug drink hiding in plain sight, the ultimate example of a more permissive pharmaceutical past. Coca-Cola contained trace amounts of coca leaf extract, not cocaine in any pharmacologically meaningful quantity, for a brief period, and the decocainization in 1903 was driven by racial anxieties being stoked in southern states rather than by health concerns, which is a significantly more uncomfortable history than the drug drink mythology provides. The original 1886 formula contained an extract of coca leaves in amounts so small that pharmacologists dispute whether they would have produced any detectable cocaine effect at all. Early Coca-Cola was more accurately a stimulant through its cola nut content, which provided caffeine, than through any cocaine component. By 1903, the company removed cocaine alkaloids from its coca leaf extract, but this decision was driven by newspaper campaigns connecting cocaine to Black Americans in the South, rather than by any scientific finding about health risks. The company has continued using decocainized coca leaf extract for flavoring purposes into the modern era, importing approximately 100 metric tons of coca leaf annually through a licensed supplier in New Jersey, which processes out the alkaloids before the extract reaches any beverage. The cocaine cola myth is substantially larger than the documented pharmacological reality. The company has never aggressively corrected it because the scandalous reputation has marketing value that accurate chemistry cannot match. 55. Mount Everest is the world's tallest mountain. Definitively, unambiguously, the highest point on Earth. The ultimate geographic superlative that ends the conversation about which mountain wins. Everest is the highest mountain above sea level. Mauna Kea in Hawaii is the tallest mountain on Earth, measured from base to summit. And Chimborazo in Ecuador is the mountain whose summit is farthest from the Earth's center, which is a different measurement of a different thing that is equally valid depending on what question you are actually asking. Mauna Kea's total height from its oceanic base is approximately 10,210 meters, significantly greater than Everest's 8,849 meters above sea level. But most of Mauna Kea sits submerged beneath the Pacific Ocean, invisible to anyone measuring from sea level. The Earth is not a perfect sphere, but an oblate spheroid that bulges at the equator. Ecuador's Chimborazo, at only 6,268 meters above sea level, sits close enough to the equatorial bulge that its summit is approximately 6,384 kilometers from Earth's center, about 2,168 meters farther from the Earth's core than Everest's summit. Everest's claim is real and meaningful by the conventional measurement standard. It is simply not the only standard, which means it is not the only winner, which means the superlative you have been repeating since childhood is accurate in one specific framing and incomplete in at least two others. 56. The Puritans fled England, seeking religious freedom. The founding story of American religious liberty, tolerance, and pluralism. The principled people who crossed an ocean so that belief could exist without persecution. The Puritans left England to practice their own religion without Anglican interference, not to create a pluralistic or tolerant society. They then established one of the most religiously restrictive communities in the early colonial world, which is the part of the story that gets left out of the Thanksgiving curriculum. The Massachusetts Bay Colony, under Puritan governance, banished, whipped, and imprisoned people for religious dissent from Puritan orthodoxy with efficiency and conviction. Roger Williams was banished in 1635 for advocating separation of church and state and founded Rhode Island as an actual experiment in religious tolerance, specifically in direct reaction to Puritan intolerance, making Rhode Island's founding a rebuke of Massachusetts rather than a continuation of it. Anne Hutchinson was tried for heresy, excommunicated, and banished in 1638 for holding unauthorized religious meetings and challenging clergy authority. 4 Quakers were executed by the Massachusetts Bay Colony between 1659 and 1661 for the specific offense of repeatedly returning to the colony after being banished. They hanged people for practicing the wrong form of Christianity. The principle of religious tolerance in America was built not by the Puritans, but in direct, documented opposition to them. The myth credits the persecutors with the values of their victims, which is a remarkable historical inversion that has survived remarkably intact. 57. August 6, 1945. The atomic bomb falls on Hiroshima. Japan recognizes the futility of further resistance, and World War II ends. A single weapon producing a decisive conclusion to the deadliest conflict in human history. Historians actively debate whether the atomic bombs or the Soviet Union's declaration of war against Japan on August 8, 1945, 2 days after Hiroshima, was the more decisive factor in Japan's surrender decision, and the debate is not resolved in favor of the clean American narrative. Historian Tsuyoshi Hasegawa's extensively researched work Racing the Enemy argues that Soviet entry into the Pacific War was at least as significant as the atomic bombs in triggering Japan's surrender, because it eliminated any remaining hope of Soviet mediation for a negotiated peace that Japan had been pursuing through diplomatic channels. Japan's Supreme War Council met after Hiroshima, but did not immediately move to surrender. The council was still actively debating continuation of the war when the Soviet declaration arrived 2 days later. The United States had been conducting conventional firebombing campaigns that killed more people per raid than the atomic bombs. The Tokyo firebombing of March 1945 killed an estimated 80,000 to 100,000 people in a single night without producing surrender. The atomic bomb is credited with ending a war that was simultaneously being ended by Soviet tanks, conventional firebombing, and a Japanese command structure finally losing its internal deadlock. It was the last in a series of dominoes that were already falling, which does not reduce its horror, but does complicate the clean narrative of a single decisive weapon changing everything. 58. Diamonds are Earth's rarest gemstone, genuinely precious by natural scarcity. Their extraordinary value an objective reflection of geological rarity and physical uniqueness that the market simply recognizes and prices accordingly. Diamonds are not particularly rare. Their perceived scarcity and high value is one of the most successful and thoroughly documented artificial market manipulations in commercial history, engineered and maintained by a single company for over a century with remarkable discipline. The De Beers Diamond Cartel, established in the late 19th century, controlled approximately 85 to 90% of the world's rough diamond supply for most of the 20th century, deliberately restricting supply to maintain artificially elevated prices. A textbook monopoly operating with a level of market control that other industries could only observe with professional admiration. The Diamonds Are Forever campaign was created by advertising agency N.W. Ayer and Son for De Beers in 1947, simultaneously constructing the tradition of diamond engagement rings as a cultural necessity, and embedding the notion that diamonds should never be resold, protecting De Beers from a secondary market that would reveal the true relationship between supply and price. Before this campaign, engagement rings were not standardized around diamonds. Sapphires, rubies, and other stones were equally common in engagement jewelry, and diamond rings were primarily an aristocratic luxury item. Rubies, alexandrite, and tanzanite are genuinely far rarer than diamonds by geological occurrence. Tanzanite, found only in one region of Tanzania, is estimated to be 1,000 times rarer than diamonds. You proposed with a marketing campaign. It was a beautiful one. It was still a campaign. 59. Genesis, the forbidden fruit, and the apple are inseparable in Western iconography, art, and cultural reference. The fruit that ended paradise, so thoroughly identified with the apple that the association feels scriptural rather than traditional. The Bible does not specify which fruit grew on the tree of knowledge of good and evil. The apple association developed through Latin translation ambiguity and European artistic convention, not through any content in the Hebrew or Greek biblical texts themselves. The Hebrew text of Genesis uses the generic word peri, meaning fruit, with no species specified. No apple is mentioned anywhere in the creation narrative. The association developed through the Latin Vulgate Bible translation by Jerome in the 4th century AD, where the Latin word malum was used, a word meaning both apple and evil in Latin simultaneously. The pun proved irresistible to interpreters and artists working in a Latin cultural context, and the image spread through centuries of European religious art that defaulted to the most familiar, temperate climate fruit available to Northern European painters. Biblical scholars and botanists have proposed figs, the first thing Adam and Eve cover themselves with after eating, pomegranates, grapes, and various other candidates based on the agricultural and geographical context of the ancient Near East where the story originates. Western civilization's most foundational story of temptation is anchored to a fruit that the original text never names. The identification came from a Latin pun made by a 4th century translator and repeated by enough painters that it became indistinguishable from Scripture. The apple earned its place through art. Theology had nothing to do with it. 60, Einstein said that the definition of insanity is doing the same thing over and over and expecting different results. The most popular Einstein quote in business presentations, self-help books, and motivational contexts worldwide, cited with the authority of the greatest scientific mind of the 20th century. Einstein never said this. The quote has no verified connection to Einstein in any letter, paper, published work, speech, or contemporary account. Its actual origin points toward 12-step recovery literature from the early 1980s, a context that is approximately as far from Einstein in time, professional field, and intellectual register as it is possible to get while remaining on the same planet. Quote investigator researchers have traced the earliest printed versions of this statement to Narcotics Anonymous literature, nowhere near Einstein in any direction. The Albert Einstein Archives in Jerusalem, which maintains the definitive record of his documented statements, has no record of the phrase. The attribution to Einstein in print appears no earlier than the 1990s, decades after his death, a pattern consistent with retroactive celebrity attachment to a saying that was already circulating and needed an authoritative name to give it additional weight. Benjamin Franklin, Mark Twain, and Winston Churchill suffer from identical patterns of posthumous misattribution. Their names function as authority stamps that attach to quotes they never produced. The quote most commonly used to argue against repeating ineffective behavior has itself been repeated millions of times in a factually incorrect form. The most shared Einstein quote is a demonstration of the very cognitive failure it claims to diagnose. He would have found this either fascinating or deeply tiresome. 61. The Great Wall of China was built to keep out the Mongols, China's definitive defensive masterpiece, purpose-built to prevent Mongol invaders from thundering across the northern steppe and penetrating the Chinese heartland. The wall was largely ineffective as a military barrier against the Mongols, who bypassed, breached, or negotiated past it multiple times, and it served more as communication and logistical infrastructure than as a literal, impenetrable barrier of defense. The Mongols under Genghis Khan and his successors conquered China not by breaking through the wall, but by finding gaps, corrupting local commanders, and exploiting political divisions within China that made coordinated defense impossible. The wall did not stop them. Much of what tourists visit today as the Great Wall was built by the Ming Dynasty between 1368 and 1644, ironically, after the Mongol Yuan dynasty had already conquered and ruled China for nearly a century. The wall was substantially reconstructed after the Mongols had already won the war it was supposedly built to prevent, which is a remarkable sequence of events. The Manchu Qing dynasty, which succeeded the Ming in 1644, conquered China partly by being let through the wall at Shanhai Pass by a Ming general making a political calculation, the definitive demonstration that the wall's weakness was always political rather than structural. The world's most famous defensive barrier failed to defend against the people it was named for, was rebuilt after those people had already won, and was ultimately opened from the inside. It is a monument to the idea of defense. The practice turned out to be considerably more complicated. 62. The Rosetta Stone was discovered in 1799, and ancient Egyptian hieroglyphics were immediately decoded. A single artifact that unlocked an entire lost civilization's written language in a moment of instant scholarly revelation. Deciphering Egyptian hieroglyphics from the Rosetta Stone took over 20 years of work by multiple competing scholars across multiple countries, involved bitter academic rivalry between British and French researchers, and was finally completed primarily by Jean-François Champollion in 1822, 23 years after the stone's discovery. Initial scholarly attempts at translation made minimal progress for over a decade after the stone became available to European researchers. British polymath Thomas Young made significant early advances between 1814 and 1819, correctly identifying that hieroglyphic cartouches represented royal names and that some signs were phonetic rather than purely symbolic, but did not achieve full decipherment. Champollion, a French scholar who had been studying Coptic, the latest surviving form of the ancient Egyptian language still used in the Egyptian Christian Church since childhood, published the foundational decipherment in 1822. His linguistic preparation was as important as the stone itself. The Rosetta Stone functioned as a key because it contained the same priestly decree in three scripts: hieroglyphic, demotic, and ancient Greek. Knowing Greek allowed scholars to work backwards, but it still required deep linguistic preparation, not simple comparison of texts. The Rosetta Stone was not a key that opened a lock. It was a clue that launched a 23-year investigation, conducted by competing international scholars who communicated poorly and credited each other reluctantly. 63. Van Gogh sold only one painting in his entire lifetime, dying broke and completely unrecognized. History's ultimate confirmation that genius is always posthumous and the market always wrong until it is embarrassingly, expensively corrected. Van Gogh sold at least one painting during his lifetime, received significant critical attention in the final year of his life, and was actively being promoted by influential critics before his death in July 1890. The confirmed sale is The Red Vineyard from 1888, purchased in 1890 by Belgian artist Anna Bach for 400 francs. Not a trivial sum. In January 1890, 6 months before his death, critic Albert Aurier published a lengthy and enthusiastic review of Van Gogh's work in the Mercure de France, describing him as a genius and predicting his future importance with considerable specificity. Van Gogh's brother Theo was a professional art dealer actively working to promote and place his work in collections. Van Gogh had significant connections within the Paris avant-garde artistic community and was not an isolated unknown operating entirely outside the art world's awareness. The total obscurity narrative consolidates a genuinely difficult situation. Van Gogh was struggling financially and emotionally in profound ways that are well documented, into a cleaner tragedy than the evidence supports. History needed a purer martyrdom and quietly edited out the critic who called him a genius 6 months before he died. The myth of complete obscurity requires ignoring everyone who was paying attention. 64. The ancient Greek Olympics were a sacred festival of athletic purity where city-states set aside their conflicts for friendly competition in a spirit of pan-Hellenic unity, noble amateurism, and civilized sportsmanship that the modern games aspire to recover. The ancient Olympics were intensely political, frequently corrupt, involved events with no modern equivalent, and the Olympic truce was regularly violated by parties who found military necessity more compelling than tradition. The Olympic truce, called the Echecheiria, did not stop all wars. It guaranteed safe passage for athletes and spectators traveling to Olympia, not a cessation of actual hostilities between city-states. Wars continued during Olympic periods, including the Peloponnesian War. The Pankration, one of the most popular ancient Olympic events, was an essentially unrestricted combat sport combining wrestling and striking with almost no rules prohibiting anything. Deaths occurred in competition. It bore considerably more resemblance to a modern cage fight than to anything currently in the Olympic program. Bribery scandals were documented throughout ancient Olympic history. The Zanes, bronze statues of Zeus erected at Olympia, were funded by fines collected from cheating athletes, and multiple ancient sources document competitors purchasing victories rather than earning them. The pure ancient Olympics was invented by 19th century European aristocrats who needed a classical precedent for their own sporting ideals, and retroactively applied it to an institution that involved cheating, political rivalry, and a combat sport with a documented body count. The Olympic ideal is a modern invention, wearing ancient Greek clothing. 65, Marco Polo spent 24 years in Asia, witnessed extraordinary things firsthand, and returned to dictate a detailed personal account of the Mongol Empire, China, and the Silk Road, one of history's great travel memoirs, the foundation of Western geographical knowledge about the East. Marco Polo dictated his account to Rustichello da Pisa, a writer of courtly romances, while both men were prisoners of war in Genoa around 1298. Rustichello's literary conventions almost certainly shaped the final text in ways that cannot now be separated from whatever Polo actually observed and reported. The book contains notable omissions that strike historians as peculiar for someone who allegedly spent 17 years in China. No mention of tea, chopsticks, foot binding, the Great Wall, Chinese written characters, or the practice of printing paper money. All things a long-term resident would almost certainly encounter and find remarkable enough to describe. Some historians, including Francis Wood, have argued in published scholarship that Polo may have compiled his account from Persian trade documents and second-hand sources, rather than exclusively from direct experience, traveling less far than claimed, and filling gaps from existing commercial intelligence. This remains a minority scholarly view, but is taken seriously enough to appear in peer-reviewed literature. The book was dismissed as fantasy by many contemporaries. Polo was reportedly nicknamed Il Milione, the Million, suggesting his claims were extravagant beyond credibility. History's most famous travel account might be partially a compilation of sources, rather than purely a memoir, which makes it either a magnificent early exercise in research synthesis or the medieval world's most consequential fabrication, depending on how charitably you read the missing chopsticks. 66, December 17th, 1903. The Wright brothers achieved the first powered, controlled airplane flight at Kitty Hawk, North Carolina, the definitively settled birth of aviation, the date on every timeline, the answer to the exam question. The Wright brothers' 1903 flights are genuinely significant, but the first designation depends entirely on how controlled powered flight is defined, and that definition was not determined purely by neutral historical analysis. Gustav Whitehead, a German-American inventor, is claimed by Connecticut and numerous aviation historians to have achieved powered flight on August 14, 1901, over 2 years before Kitty Hawk, based on contemporary newspaper accounts and witness testimony gathered at the time. Jane's All the World's Aircraft, the leading aviation reference publication, formally recognized this claim in 2013 after reviewing the available evidence. New Zealand farmer Richard Pearce is claimed by New Zealand historians to have made a powered flight as early as March 1903, also before Kitty Hawk, though the evidence relies primarily on witness testimony gathered decades later. The Smithsonian Institution's long reluctance to recognize other claimants was significantly complicated by its own contractual arrangement with Orville Wright. The Wright family donated the flyer to the Smithsonian on the explicit condition that it be displayed as the first aircraft capable of flight, a contractual designation, not a purely scientific one. The first flight was certified, partly through a museum contract. The contractual footnote did not make the exhibit label. 67. Alcohol warms you up in cold weather. The classic cold weather remedy. A shot of spirits to warm the blood, raise the core temperature, and stave off the chill of a winter night, with physiological efficiency wrapped in a pleasant tradition. Alcohol causes the sensation of warmth by dilating blood vessels near the skin surface, which actually accelerates heat loss from the body's core. The precise opposite of warming you, achieved through a mechanism that your body experiences as warmth while it is losing heat faster than before you drank anything. Alcohol is a vasodilator. It causes peripheral blood vessels near the skin to expand, rushing warm blood to the surface and creating a genuine subjective sensation of warmth while simultaneously increasing the rate at which your body radiates heat into the surrounding environment. Core body temperature drops when alcohol is consumed in cold conditions, even as the drinker feels increasingly comfortable. This is physiologically dangerous, precisely because the subjective sensation actively masks the objective condition, removing the discomfort that would otherwise prompt a sober person to seek shelter or add clothing. This mechanism is a significant contributing factor in hypothermia deaths involving alcohol. Intoxicated individuals feel warm, make poor decisions about continued cold exposure, and lose core heat faster than sober individuals in identical conditions. The St. Bernard dog with a brandy barrel around its neck, the image most responsible for the alcohol warms rescuers mythology, is itself almost entirely fictional. The Alpine monks of the Great St. Bernard Hospice have stated the dogs never carried brandy barrels. The warming tradition is a comfort mechanism that works by concealing the problem rather than addressing it. 68. Napoleon was defeated primarily by Wellington at Waterloo on June 18, 1815. The Iron Duke versus the Little Corporal. Britain saves Europe. The climactic military confrontation that defines the Napoleonic era and ends it. Waterloo was won by a combined Allied force in which the Prussian army under Field Marshal Gebhard Leberecht von Blücher played an arguably decisive role, arriving at a critical moment in the afternoon that converted a grinding stalemate into a French catastrophe. The Prussian army arrived late on June 18th with approximately 50,000 troops, attacking Napoleon's right flank and rear at the precise moment his assault on Wellington's center was at its most intense, and Wellington's position was under maximum pressure. Wellington himself described the battle as the nearest run thing you ever saw in your life, and acknowledged explicitly that without the Prussian arrival, the outcome was genuinely uncertain rather than predestined. Napoleon had sent Marshal Grouchy with 33,000 French troops to pursue the Prussians after the Battle of Ligny 2 days earlier, specifically to prevent their return to the Waterloo battlefield. Grouchy's failure to intercept Blücher was as operationally decisive as any action fought on the Waterloo field itself. The framing of Waterloo as primarily a British victory was substantially constructed by British historiography throughout the 19th century, which had political and national incentives to emphasize Wellington over Blücher, and to present the defeat of Napoleon as a British achievement rather than a coalition one. Wellington won a battle at which the decisive blow was delivered by someone else, and British historiography celebrated it as a solo performance for 2 centuries. The Prussians saved Europe and received a footnote. 69. Dr. Joseph Ignace Guillotin invented the execution device that bears his name and created the defining symbol of revolutionary terror. The French physician, whose contribution to the mechanics of death was so significant that history attached his name to the machine permanently. Guillotin did not invent the guillotine. He advocated to the French National Assembly in 1789 for a humane, standardized execution method that would apply equally regardless of the condemned person's social class. A reform position motivated by Enlightenment egalitarianism, not engineering ambition. The device was actually designed by Dr. Antoine Louis, Secretary of the Academy of Surgery, in collaboration with a German harpsichord maker named Tobias Schmidt, who built the first functional prototype in 1792. The machine was initially called the Louisette or Louison after Dr. Louis, and only became associated with Guillotin's name through popular usage following his public advocacy for the concept of mechanical decapitation as policy. Guillotin and his family were so thoroughly horrified by the permanent association that after his death in 1814, his children petitioned the French government to rename the device. When the government declined, the family changed their surname instead, rather than continue sharing it with the instrument. He proposed mercy, got nothing built, had his name attached to the result by accident, watched it become the symbol of mass terror, and his children eventually changed their name to escape the association. History's sense of irony has always been disproportionate to the offense. 70. In 1519, Hernan Cortés arrives in Mexico, and the Aztecs, particularly Emperor Moctezuma, welcome him as the returning god Quetzalcoatl, a myth-driven failure of recognition that enables the entire Spanish conquest through a theological misidentification with catastrophic consequences. The Cortés as Quetzalcoatl narrative is almost certainly a post-conquest fabrication, developed decades after the events it describes, primarily through Spanish-influenced indigenous accounts that serve the conqueror's need for a legitimizing explanation. The primary sources for the Quetzalcoatl identification are post-conquest indigenous accounts compiled by Spanish friars, most notably Sahagun's Florentine Codex, written decades after the conquest and filtered through Spanish colonial editorial priorities. Contemporary Aztec accounts of the Spanish arrival describe them as unusual and threatening foreigners, strange people, not as returning deities whose arrival had been foretold. Moctezuma's behavior during the conquest was politically complex and strategically motivated, not theologically awestruck by the appearance of a god on the expected schedule. Historian Camilla Townsend's research argues the Quetzalcoatl identification is almost certainly a later developed myth that served multiple political purposes simultaneously. It explained the Aztec defeat without attributing it purely to Spanish military superiority, and provided the Spanish with a providential legitimacy for their conquest that made the violence easier to narrate as destiny. The Aztec Empire maintained sophisticated intelligence networks and diplomatic machinery. It was not an empire that would mistake armed foreign soldiers for returning gods based on calendar mythology. The myth serves the conqueror's narrative better than it serves the historical record, which is precisely the kind of myth that empires consistently produce about the people they have defeated. 71. Einstein's brain was so extraordinary that its preservation and study after his death revealed the physical, anatomical explanation for his genius. Science finally identifying the biological substrate that produced the greatest mind of the 20th century. Einstein's brain was removed during his autopsy without his consent and against his explicit wishes, which had specified cremation and scattered ashes. Pathologist Thomas Harvey removed it and kept it, a decision that was ethically indefensible by any standard applicable to human remains, and legally questionable by the standards of the time. Harvey held the brain for decades, parceling out samples to researchers across different institutions over many years, and the brain spent considerable time stored in a cider box beneath a cooler in his office, an end that no one designing a dignified memorial for any human being would have selected. Studies have reported various anatomical features, including an unusual parietal lobe structure and a higher-than-average ratio of glial cells to neurons. But neuroscientists largely regard these findings as inconclusive and methodologically limited. You cannot compare one brain to population averages without controlling for variables that cannot be controlled for posthumously. Einstein's daughter opposed the retention of his brain. The bulk of remaining tissue was eventually distributed to museums and research institutions over subsequent decades. The man who unlocked relativity requested his remains be scattered anonymously and was instead dissected without permission, stored in a cider box, and carved into samples mailed around the world for 60 years. He had more control over space and time during his life than over his own body after it ended. 72. Ancient Romans used the vomitorium, a special room where decadent diners purged between courses to make room for more food. The defining image of imperial excess and the architectural embodiment of Roman indulgence taken to its logical extreme. A vomitorium was a passageway in an amphitheater or theater through which crowds could rapidly exit the seating area. It has nothing to do with vomiting as a dietary practice and was never a room designated for purging after meals. The Latin word vomitorium derives from vomere, meaning to spew out, referring to the rapid expulsion of large crowds through stadium exits. A crowd management innovation that allowed tens of thousands of spectators to enter and leave Roman venues with efficiency that modern stadium architects still study. Roman amphitheaters and theaters were specifically designed with multiple vomitoria to manage audience flow, a practical architectural feature not a monument to culinary excess. While some Roman sources do describe elite individuals occasionally purging to continue eating at extraordinarily extended banquets, this was considered excessive and worthy of moral condemnation even by Roman standards. Seneca and other moralists criticized it explicitly. The association of vomitoria with dining rooms appears to have developed in the 20th century through a misreading of the architectural term, possibly via Aldous Huxley's 1923 novel Antic Hay, which used the word in a non-architectural context. The Romans were genuinely excessive in numerous documented ways that require no fictional dining rooms to illustrate. History invented the room anyway, because the true function of an exit corridor is considerably less satisfying as a symbol of imperial decadence. 300 Spartans held the pass at Thermopylae against a Persian army of 1 million. The ultimate story of heroic, doomed resistance against mathematically impossible odds, the moment that defined Western civilization's self-image of freedom against tyranny. The 300 Spartans were accompanied by thousands of other Greek soldiers, and the Persian army, while enormous, almost certainly numbered in the hundreds of thousands rather than the millions that Herodotus's figures suggest. Herodotus's count of 2.5 million Persian combatants is considered implausible by modern military historians and logisticians. Supplying that number of soldiers in 480 BC would have required supply chains that the ancient world's infrastructure could not support across the terrain involved. Modern estimates for the Persian army range from approximately 100,000 to 300,000, still a massive force, but a fraction of the ancient claim. The Greek force at Thermopylae included not just 300 Spartiates, but approximately 700 Thespians, 400 Thebans, and several hundred other Greeks, totaling perhaps 7,000 at the battle's opening. The Thespians who remained to fight and die alongside the Spartans at the end deserve recognition that they almost never receive. Unlike the Spartans, the Thespian soldiers were not a professional warrior class defending their city from a protected position. They stayed and died while their city was subsequently burned to the ground by the Persians. The story was already extraordinary without editing. History decided it was insufficient and dropped the allied Greeks, inflated the Persians by a factor of 10, and assigned all available credit to the most photogenic contingent. 74. Lee Harvey Oswald acted alone in assassinating President Kennedy on November 22, 1963. A conclusion established by the Warren Commission, confirmed as settled historical fact, and sufficient to close the question for anyone relying on official findings rather than speculation. The lone gunman conclusion is the finding of the Warren Commission. A subsequent official United States government investigation reached a different conclusion. The House Select Committee on Assassinations, established by Congress and reporting its findings in 1979, concluded based on acoustic evidence that 4 shots were fired rather than 3, suggesting a second gunman, and that Kennedy was probably assassinated as a result of a conspiracy, making this not a fringe theory, but an official congressional finding that directly contradicts the Warren Commission. The acoustic evidence the HSCA relied upon was subsequently challenged by a 1982 National Academy of Sciences panel, which concluded it did not support the 4-shot finding, leaving the official record in a genuine unresolved conflict between 2 separate official government investigations that reached contradictory conclusions. Kennedy assassination documents have been released in batches under the JFK Records Collection Act, with final releases occurring as recently as 2022 and 2023, with some material still withheld. Calling this question definitively settled is not accurate. 2 official United States government investigations reached contradictory conclusions, and the version consistently taught as settled history is the first one, as though the second investigation never produced a report and submitted it to Congress. 75. Every 7 years, your body replaces all its cells completely, making you a literally new person on a biological level. A fact that people find reassuring, philosophically interesting, and occasionally useful for avoiding accountability, for things they did 8 years ago. Different cells replace at vastly different rates, ranging from days to never, and some neurons in your cerebral cortex appear to last your entire lifetime without replacement, meaning part of you is literally as old as you are and has been present for every experience you have ever had. Red blood cells are replaced approximately every 120 days. Intestinal epithelial cells turn over every 2 to 5 days. Skin cells replace approximately every 2 to 3 weeks. These short-cycle cells support the renewal narrative, but represent only a portion of the biological picture. Neurons in the cerebral cortex, the regions associated with thought, consciousness, memory, and the processing of information including this sentence, are largely original cells from birth and are not replaced throughout a person's lifetime in most regions. Swedish researcher Jonas Friesen's work using carbon-14 dating established that different cell types have dramatically different ages within the same individual simultaneously. Heart muscle cells replace at approximately 1% per year, meaning by age 70, roughly 45% of your heart cells are original from birth. You are not new every 7 years. You are a patchwork of different biological ages, wearing the same face, and the part of you processing this correction right now may be as old as you are. 76. Marco Polo brought gunpowder back from China to Europe, another transformative technology introduced to the West through his travels, the one responsible for reshaping European warfare and ultimately enabling the military dominance that defined the modern era. Gunpowder was known in Europe well before Marco Polo's return in 1295, and its transmission from China to Europe occurred through Islamic intermediaries over several centuries of gradual diffusion along existing trade routes, rather than through a single traveler making a dramatic delivery. Roger Bacon described gunpowder in European writing around 1267, years before Polo returned from Asia. Arabic texts describe gunpowder formulas from at least the mid-13th century, indicating Islamic scholars had significant and independent gunpowder knowledge that did not require Marco Polo as an intermediary. Gunpowder technology traveled westward from China, through Central Asia, and the Islamic world across multiple centuries, transmitted by traders, soldiers, and scholars along routes that predated any individual European journey to Asia. Marco Polo has been credited with importing enough Chinese inventions to fill a trade fair: pasta, gunpowder, paper money, and historians have disproved most of the attributions individually as the primary mechanism of transmission. He has become a convenient delivery service for any technology whose European origin story is complicated by the messiness of actual historical diffusion. The postal service of civilization, that may never have made most of its supposed deliveries, continues to receive the credit anyway, because a single dramatic figure carrying ideas across a mountain range is a better story than centuries of anonymous commercial exchange. 77. NASA staged the Apollo 11 moon landing on a film set in July 1969, while astronauts orbited safely above, and the world watched the greatest televised deception in history, a performance so convincing that it has never been definitively exposed despite decades of investigation by millions of people motivated to find the evidence. The Apollo moon landings are among the most extensively verified events in human history, confirmed by independent international evidence, including real-time observation by the Soviet Union, a government that had every geopolitical incentive to expose American fraud and the technical capability to detect it. The Soviet Union was engaged in a direct space race with the United States, operated its own deep space tracking network, and monitored the Apollo 11 mission in real time. They did not publicly challenge its authenticity. A successful exposure of American fraud would have been the Cold War's greatest propaganda victory, delivered at the moment of maximum global attention. The Soviets would have published the evidence before Armstrong's boot touched the surface, if the evidence had existed. Retroreflectors placed on the lunar surface during Apollo missions can be and are regularly used by observatories worldwide, including non-American ones, to bounce laser signals that confirm human-placed equipment exists on the moon. Lunar samples brought back by astronauts have been studied by scientists worldwide, including Soviet scientists who received samples through a bilateral exchange program, and contain rock formations consistent with lunar origin and inconsistent with anything found on Earth. The moon landing conspiracy theory requires the USSR to have watched an American fraud in real time and said nothing. That single requirement makes it the most historically implausible element of an already implausible theory. 78. Thomas Edison invented the light bulb, the lone genius who illuminated the modern world through solitary inspiration. One man producing one breakthrough that changed civilization forever and earned him the title his legacy has carried ever since. Edison did not invent the light bulb. He improved an existing technology and, crucially, built the commercial infrastructure to deliver it at scale. The genuine achievement was the electrical system surrounding the bulb, not the bulb itself, which is where the actual engineering genius was concentrated. Humphrey Davy demonstrated electric arc lighting as early as 1802. Joseph Swan in Britain developed and patented a viable incandescent light bulb in 1878, a full year before Edison's version reached comparable functionality. Swan sued Edison for patent infringement and won, eventually forcing them into a joint company in Britain, a legal outcome that directly contradicts the lone inventor narrative. Edison's real achievement was developing a practical incandescent bulb with a high-resistance carbon filament that could be commercially manufactured, and then building the entire electrical distribution system: generators, wiring, meters, switches, and the commercial model, to deliver it into homes at a price consumers could accept. Invention in Edison's case was a systematic, team-based industrial process. Menlo Park employed dozens of researchers working in coordinated parallel, an invention factory by Edison's own description, not a solitary workshop. History gave him credit for the glass and ignored the miles of wire, which is precisely backwards from where the civilization-changing work actually was. 79. 90% of your brain sits idle at any given moment. Untapped potential waiting to be unlocked. A cognitive reserve that would produce superhuman capability if you could only find the right technique, supplement, or self-help framework to access it. Brain imaging technology has definitively shown that virtually all regions of the brain are active at various times during normal function, and most brain regions are active nearly continuously during normal waking life, leaving essentially no idle 90% available for dramatic unlocking. Functional MRI and PET scan imaging conducted across thousands of subjects show activity distributed throughout the entire brain during normal cognitive tasks, not concentrated in isolated 10% regions, while the rest waits unused. From an evolutionary and metabolic standpoint alone, the myth is implausible. The brain consumes approximately 20% of the body's total energy, while comprising only 2% of body weight. An organ that metabolically expensive would not have been preserved through millions of years of evolution if 90% of it were non-functional. Natural selection eliminates costly structures that provide no benefit with considerable efficiency. Brain damage studies confirm the point. Damage to virtually any region of the brain produces some identifiable functional deficit. If 90% were genuinely unused, most brain injuries would be harmless. The myth's origin involves a misinterpretation of early neuroscience findings about the ratio of glial cells to neurons, and possibly misquoted William James' writings about unrealized human potential. The 10% myth is the cognitive equivalent of being told your house is 90% empty. The rooms are occupied. This is already everything you have. That conclusion is less marketable as a self-help premise, which is why the correction has never sold as well as the original claim. 80. 1789. The Bastille falls, liberty triumphs, and France transitions from royal tyranny to democratic freedom. The birth of modern republican government. The moment when the principles of the Enlightenment became political reality in the most influential nation in Europe. The French Revolution produced over a decade of escalating violence, the Reign of Terror, multiple collapsed governments, and ultimately Napoleon's authoritarian rule. A trajectory that contradicts the immediate liberty narrative with such consistency that the gap between the stated ideals and the actual sequence of events deserves more than a footnote. The Reign of Terror from 1793 to 1794 resulted in approximately 17,000 official executions and up to 40,000 total deaths, conducted by the Revolutionary Committee of Public Safety, a government systematically murdering its own citizens for ideological deviation from revolutionary correctness, using the vocabulary of liberty as justification. Between 1789 and 1799, France went through at least 5 distinct governmental structures: constitutional monarchy, the First Republic, the Committee of Public Safety, the Directory, and the Consulate, none of which were stable democratic governments by any reasonable definition. Napoleon seized power in November 1799, exactly a decade after the revolution began, and proceeded through increasingly autocratic structures, culminating in self-coronation as emperor in 1804. France did not achieve stable republican democracy until the Third Republic, established in 1870, 81 years after the Revolution, and after 2 more monarchies and another empire had come and gone. The Revolution promised liberty, delivered the guillotine, and took 80 years to arrive somewhere resembling its stated destination. History compresses this into a single, triumphant moment because the full trajectory is considerably harder to celebrate. 81. Columbus sailed west, died believing he had reached Asia, and never knew what he had actually found. History's most poignant case of dying without knowing the significance of your own accomplishment. The explorer who changed the world without understanding what he had changed it with. Columbus may well have privately understood that he had reached lands previously unknown to Europeans, even while maintaining the Asia narrative publicly for financial and legal reasons that made honesty about his actual findings professionally dangerous. By his 3rd and 4th voyages, Columbus was encountering the South American mainland, a continental landmass far too large to be consistent with island chains off the Asian coast. He wrote in his journal of the 3rd voyage in 1498 that he believed he had reached another world, a phrase that suggests awareness of encountering something distinct from Asia, even without using the word continent. Columbus's financial and political situation required him to maintain that he had reached Asia for contractual reasons. His agreement with the Spanish crown promised him rewards and titles based on finding a route to Asia, making admission of a different destination a legal and financial problem rather than a purely intellectual question. The dying in ignorance narrative was useful to those who wanted to credit Amerigo Vespucci with recognizing a new world. Vespucci's Mundus Novus, letter of 1503, explicitly describes a new continent, conveniently supporting his name being attached to it. Columbus may have privately known what he had found while legally unable to say so, which is less poignant than the ignorance story, and considerably more interesting as a portrait of someone trapped between discovery and contract. 82. Volta invented the battery because Galvani's frog leg experiments inspired him. A beautiful scientific relay race in which one discovery naturally led to the next. One scientist's observation sparking another's invention in the collaborative tradition of Enlightenment natural philosophy. Volta invented the voltaic pile specifically to disprove Galvani's theory. He believed Galvani was wrong about animal electricity, and built the battery to prove electricity was chemical rather than biological in origin, making the most consequential electrical invention in history the product of an argument rather than of inspiration or collaborative enthusiasm. Galvani's 1791 experiments showed that frog leg muscles twitched when 2 different metals touched them in the presence of moisture, which he interpreted as evidence of animal electricity, an innate electrical force residing in living tissue. Volta disagreed fundamentally, arguing the electricity came from the contact between 2 dissimilar metals, and that the moist tissue was simply serving as a conductor. He spent years developing an alternative theoretical framework. To prove Galvani wrong, Volta built the voltaic pile around 1800, alternating disks of zinc and copper separated by brine-soaked cardboard, producing continuous electrical current without any biological material whatsoever. Both were partially correct. Contact between dissimilar metals in an electrolytic solution does produce electricity, validating Volta's model, while biological tissues do conduct and generate electrical signals, validating what Galvani was observing, even if his theoretical explanation was flawed. Their scientific argument was more productive than either fully realized during the dispute. Science's most productive moments are frequently two people in a disagreement furious enough to build something to settle it, and the battery is the most consequential example in the history of the practice. 83. The Dark Ages accurately describes the millennium between Rome's fall and the Renaissance. A vast intellectual and cultural void, a period of ignorance, superstition, and civilizational stagnation before Europe rebooted and human achievement resumed at the point where classical antiquity had left off. The term Dark Ages is no longer used by professional medieval historians, who regard it as a misleading Renaissance-era rhetorical invention that obscures genuine cultural, scientific, and artistic achievement across the medieval period, while serving the self-promotional needs of the people who coined it. The term was coined by Petrarch in the 14th century as a deliberate rhetorical contrast between classical antiquity and his own era, a literary device positioning Renaissance humanists as the revival of civilization after a period they caricatured for self-serving reasons, not a neutral historical assessment derived from examination of the evidence. The Islamic Golden Age, running roughly from the 8th through the 13th centuries, produced foundational advances in mathematics, astronomy, medicine, and philosophy during the same period, preservation and significant extension of classical knowledge that was subsequently transmitted back to Europe and enabled the developments the Renaissance took credit for. Medieval Europe produced Notre Dame Cathedral, Chartres, the Summa Theologica, Dante's Divine Comedy, Gothic architecture, and the university system, none of which are consistent with a culturally dead era by any coherent definition. The Dark Ages were named by people who needed something to be reborn from. History does not have clean dark patches. It has periods that have not been marketed effectively enough, and the medieval millennium is the most egregiously undermarketed period in Western history. 84, whatever else fascism did, Mussolini at least made the trains run on time. The concession that even brutal authoritarian efficiency has practical upsides, the one positive cliché about a regime that produced almost no others, repeated by people who want to seem nuanced about historical evil. Italian trains were already improving before Mussolini came to power in 1922. The punctuality improvements were modest and concentrated on showcase routes used to impress foreign visitors, and the trains-on-time reputation was largely propaganda repeated by foreign journalists who did not independently verify what they were told they were observing. Italian railway reforms began under the liberal government that preceded Mussolini's march on Rome. The systematic improvements credited to fascism were substantially underway before the political transition occurred. The trains-on-time reputation was built primarily on favorable reporting from foreign visitors who rode prestigious express lines and reported what they were shown. The showcase routes maintained for foreign dignitaries rather than the regional network used by ordinary Italians. Italian journalist Luigi Barzini Jr., who traveled extensively in fascist Italy, wrote that the trains-on-time claim was wildly exaggerated and that Italian railways remained chronically imperfect under Mussolini by any honest accounting. The phrase entered international circulation primarily through credulous foreign observers who allowed fascist propaganda to shape their reporting without applying the verification standards they would have applied elsewhere. The single positive cliché about fascism was substantially fabricated by the fascists themselves and repeated by journalists who only rode the best trains. The efficiency of the regime extended most reliably to managing its own reputation. The trains were adequate, the reporting was considerably better than that. 85. The Great Wall of China is made primarily of stone, a magnificent masonry barrier stretching thousands of miles across China's northern frontier, one of history's great feats of stonework, and one of the most recognizable architectural achievements in human history. The wall was built across different dynasties from vastly different materials, depending entirely on what was locally available. And large sections are made of compacted earth rather than stone or brick at any point in their construction. The earliest sections, built during the Qin dynasty around 221 to 206 BC, were primarily constructed of rammed earth called hangtu, layers of compacted soil pressed between wooden frames and allowed to set, not masonry of any kind. The iconic stone and brick sections that tourists visit were built during the Ming dynasty between 1368 and 1644. The most recent major construction period, concentrated in areas near Beijing where suitable stone was accessible and where the military threat was considered most acute. In desert regions of western China, the wall was constructed from materials including reeds and compacted gravel, whatever the local terrain provided in sufficient quantities. The wall is not a single continuous structure, but a series of walls built at different times by different dynasties, with some sections running parallel to each other, some overlapping, and some entirely disconnected by geography. The image of the Great Wall derives almost entirely from the tourist-accessible Ming Dynasty sections near Beijing, representing one portion of one dynasty's contribution across a construction history spanning nearly 2 millennia. The older earthen sections in remote areas are literally returning to the soil they were made from. The Great Wall is a greatest hits compilation from multiple eras, presented as a single unified monument. 86. Tesla and Edison were on opposite sides of a friendly scientific competition. Two great minds debating electrical current in the collegial tradition of scientific disagreement, a professional rivalry that history has romanticized as the War of Currents. Edison conducted a deliberate, funded, and personally directed campaign to discredit Tesla's alternating current through public demonstrations of animal electrocutions, specifically designed to frighten the public and destroy AC's commercial prospects before they could threaten his direct current business. Edison's team, primarily Harold P. Brown, working with Edison's financial backing, publicly electrocuted dogs and calves using AC current to demonstrate its lethality to audiences that included reporters. Edison actively lobbied state governments to adopt AC current for executions, specifically to associate Tesla and Westinghouse's technology with state killing in the public mind. The electric chair, introduced in New York in 1890, used AC current at Edison's direct advocacy, a fact that requires a moment to fully absorb. Edison also allegedly promised Tesla $50,000 for solving a difficult engineering problem, and then claimed it was a joke when Tesla completed the work, which is a category of professional conduct that has its own vocabulary, and none of it is flattering. Tesla's AC system ultimately won commercially, because it was technically superior for long-distance power transmission. Westinghouse used it to power the 1893 Chicago World's Fair and won the contract to harness Niagara Falls. History called it a war of currents. Systematic sabotage campaign is the more accurate description, but it is harder to fit on an exhibit label. 87. Queen Victoria was a prim, joyless prude whose personal repression defined an entire era of buttoned-up Victorian morality. The black-clad widow, whose character set the emotional temperature of a civilization and whose legacy is synonymous with sexual and social restriction. Victoria's personal life was characterized by documented passion, romantic intensity, and emotional expressiveness that contradict the repressed widow image with considerable force. Her letters to Prince Albert and her diary entries are remarkably candid about physical attraction and marital intimacy for a 19th century public figure, not the correspondence of someone emotionally flattened by propriety. After Albert's death, she slept with a cast of his hand beside her, and was buried with his dressing gown and a plaster of his hand, expressions of grief that are extravagant rather than suppressed. Her relationship with her Scottish attendant John Brown after Albert's death was intimate enough in its documented dimensions that contemporaries and some historians have speculated about its nature without reaching consensus. Victorian morality was significantly a middle-class and upper-class performance standard. The working class in Victorian Britain had considerably different behavioral norms, and the era's repressive reputation reflects one economic stratum's documented experience applied universally across an entire society. The repressed Victorian image was substantially constructed by the Edwardian and then modernist generations that followed, who needed a repressed past to define their own liberation against. Victoria wore black for 40 years, and thereby looked the part of the character that the next generation needed her to be. History gave her the role. The diary entries tell a different story. 88. The Berlin Wall fell on November 9, 1989, because careful diplomacy, Gorbachev's reforms, and the accumulated weight of history produced a managed, coordinated transition toward German reunification, a moment of deliberate political architecture reflecting the best of statesmanship. The Berlin Wall fell primarily because of a miscommunication at a press conference. An East German spokesman misread his briefing notes and accidentally announced the wall was open immediately, triggering crowds that overwhelmed border guards before anyone in authority could reverse the statement or manage the consequences. East German Politburo spokesman Günter Schabowski held a press conference on November 9th to announce new travel regulations that were supposed to allow East Germans to apply for exit visas, with conditions attached and a start date yet to be confirmed by relevant authorities. Schabowski had not attended the meeting where the policy was finalized and misread his notes, announcing when asked by a reporter that the regulations were effective immediately, without delay, a statement he had no authority to make and which was factually incorrect as a description of the actual policy. The announcement was broadcast live on East and West German television. Crowds began gathering at checkpoints within hours of the broadcast. Border guards, receiving no contrary orders from a command structure that had frozen in confusion, eventually opened the gates rather than face the growing crowds with force. The opening was not planned, not coordinated with allied governments, and not the result of diplomatic decision-making on that specific evening. It was a bureaucratic error that moved faster than any government could manage. The Cold War ended not with a strategic masterstroke, but with a press conference that nobody stopped in time. History's hinge moments are not always planned by the people turning them. 89. Captain Edward Smith recklessly sped through iceberg-laden waters on the Titanic's maiden voyage, ignoring multiple ice warnings under pressure from White Star Line to set a speed record. The human face of corporate-driven recklessness producing an avoidable catastrophe. Smith received ice warnings, and his decision to maintain speed was consistent with accepted maritime practice of the period, not exceptional recklessness by the professional standards that governed his conduct, and the record pressure narrative lacks documentary support. The Titanic received multiple ice caution telegrams on April 14, 1912, from other ships operating in the same area. Smith's response, posting additional lookouts and continuing at speed, was consistent with how experienced commanders of the era operated in ice-reported areas, a standard that looks inadequate in retrospect, but was not unusual by contemporary professional norms. No confirmed evidence exists that White Star Line's managing director, J. Bruce Ismay, who was aboard, pressured Smith to maintain speed to set a crossing record. Ismay survived the sinking and was publicly condemned, making him a convenient villain. But the record pressure story is constructed from implication rather than documentation. The Titanic was not attempting a speed record in any case. It was too new and underpowered compared to the record-holding Mauretania. The planned arrival was already 1 day later than a record crossing would have required. The real failures were systemic. Insufficient lifeboat capacity written into regulations designed for smaller ships. A binocular case locked with a key that departed with a disembarking officer. And inadequate emergency preparation for a vessel carrying over 2,000 people. The ship needed a human villain to explain its loss. The captain, conveniently dead, was the available candidate. 90. Sherlock Holmes told Watson, "Elementary, my dear Watson," the most famous catchphrase in detective fiction, the line that defines the character's voice across every adaptation. The phrase so associated with Holmes that questioning it feels like questioning whether he wore a deerstalker. Arthur Conan Doyle never wrote this line, not once, across the complete canon of 60 Holmes stories, 4 novels, and 56 short stories. Does the complete phrase, "Elementary, my dear Watson," appear in any form? Holmes does say elementary in some stories. He does frequently address Watson as "my dear Watson" in various contexts throughout the canon. The combination of those two elements in that specific sequence does not appear in anything Doyle wrote and published. The phrase appears to have emerged through theatrical and early film adaptations of the Holmes stories, possibly appearing in a form resembling it in P.G. Wodehouse's 1909 novel Smith and the City, which parodies the Holmes stories, and was cemented by the enormously popular Basil Rathbone film series of the 1930s and 40s, which reached audiences vastly larger than the original readership. This belongs to the category of fictional characters whose signature lines do not exist in the original source material, a category that also includes "Beam Me Up, Scotty" from Star Trek and "Play It Again, Sam" from Casablanca, where the remembered version and the written version diverged at some point, and the remembered version won decisively. Holmes would find this fascinating as a case study in collective false memory. The solution, as always, requires checking the primary source that everyone assumes they know. 91. Charles Darwin's scandalous claim was that humans descended from monkeys. The idea that sent Victorian England into theological crisis and gave cartoonists a subject they have not exhausted since. Darwin never said humans descended from monkeys. His theory describes humans and modern apes sharing common ancestors, a distinction that is not semantic pedantry, but a scientifically fundamental difference between two genuinely different claims about how evolution operates. The Origin of Species in 1859 barely mentions human evolution at all. Darwin was deliberately cautious about the subject, including only the observation that light will be thrown on the origin of man and his history, an understatement calculated to minimize the immediate theological controversy the book would generate on other grounds. Darwin addressed human evolution directly in The Descent of Man in 1871, arguing that humans and other great apes share common ancestral lineages, not that humans are descended from any currently living primate species. Modern monkeys are themselves a separate evolutionary branch from the great apes. Saying humans descended from monkeys is as scientifically accurate as saying you are descended from your cousin rather than that you and your cousin share grandparents. The distinction matters because the actual claim is both more interesting and more accurate than the version that was attacked. The descended from monkeys formulation was used by Darwin's opponents specifically to make evolution sound absurd, and was therefore repeated constantly in anti-evolutionary polemic. It was misattributed to Darwin so persistently that 2 centuries later, people cite it as his position. His opponents invented the ridicule. History attributed the ridicule to the man being ridiculed. 92. The United States Constitution was designed to create a democracy, the founding document of American self-governance, built by the founders to produce a government of, by, and for the people, in direct contrast to the aristocratic and monarchical systems of the Old World. The founders were explicitly, and in some cases vehemently, opposed to pure democracy. They designed a constitutional republic with multiple specific mechanisms intended to limit direct democratic expression, and they said so in the documents explaining their reasoning. James Madison wrote in Federalist No. 10 that pure democracy leads to instability and factional violence, arguing explicitly for a representative republic as a superior system, specifically because it filters popular passion through elected intermediaries. The word democracy does not appear in the Constitution or in the Declaration of Independence. The original Constitution included the Electoral College, designed to filter popular presidential preference through selected electors, an unelected Senate, chosen by state legislatures rather than popular vote until the 17th Amendment in 1913, and a Supreme Court with lifetime appointments, three deliberately counter-majoritarian mechanisms built into the foundational document. Property requirements for voting existed in most states at the founding, and enslaved people, women, and most non-property owning white men were excluded from participation entirely. The founders designed a system to prevent the majority from having too direct a hand in government and named it a democracy for the next 2 centuries of use. They had a specific definition of what they were building. History subsequently applied a different definition to what they built, which is either an evolution of democratic theory or a substantial rebranding of the original design, depending on how carefully you read the Electoral College. 93. The pyramids of Giza were built by vast slave armies, driven under the whip by Egyptian overseers. Monuments of tyranny constructed on the broken backs of enslaved humanity. The defining ancient example of forced labor, producing architectural immortality. Archaeological evidence from workers' villages at Giza indicates the pyramid builders were paid, fed, medically treated workers organized through a rotating labor system, not enslaved people, and the physical evidence for this is not ambiguous or thin. Excavations of workers' villages at Giza, conducted by archaeologist Mark Leiner and Egyptologist Zahi Hawass beginning in the 1990s, revealed organized settlements containing bakeries, breweries, and a medical facility, showing evidence of surgical bone treatment, a level of investment in worker welfare that is inconsistent with enslaved labor by any historical standard applied consistently. Workers' tombs found near the pyramids contain inscriptions indicating their builders were proud of their work and regarded it as honorable service. The tombs themselves would not exist if these were enslaved people with no social standing or recognized identity. Graffiti found within pyramid superstructure blocks includes workers' gang names, such as Friends of Khufu and Drunkards of Menkaura, expressions of group identity and workplace culture that are inconsistent with the conditions of enslaved labor. The Greek historian Herodotus, writing roughly 2,000 years after the pyramids were built, described 100,000 slaves, a figure derived from tradition rather than contemporary Egyptian records, and inconsistent with what the physical evidence has produced since systematic excavation began. The slave-built pyramids narrative is in virtually every ancient history course taught in the Western world, and is supported primarily by a Greek tourist writing 2 millennia after the fact. The archaeology tells a different story, and it has been telling it for decades without significantly affecting the curriculum. 94. Nero burned Rome deliberately in 64 AD to clear land for his extravagant Domus Aurea palace, the act of a decadent emperor who incinerated his own city to build himself a golden house, the definitive example of imperial power exercised without consequence or restraint. No reliable ancient source definitively places responsibility on Nero. His alibi is recorded even by hostile sources, and the palace construction timeline does not support a premeditated land-clearing theory when examined against the chronological evidence. Tacitus, the most detailed ancient source on the fire, and no admirer of Nero by any reading of his work, does not definitively blame Nero. He reports the accusation, and Nero's counter-accusation blaming Christians as contemporary conflicting narratives, neither of which he endorses as established fact. The Domus Aurea's construction on the fire's cleared land created the visual impression of premeditation, but opportunistic construction on disaster-cleared urban land was common practice in ancient city development, and does not constitute evidence of arson as the cause of the clearing. Nero was at his villa in Antium when the fire started, a fact recorded by sources hostile to him. and returned to organize relief and open his estates to displaced citizens, by Tacitus's own account. The Great Fire started in the merchant area near the Circus Maximus, a dense district of wooden structures where accidental fires were not unusual and where the specific location was not obviously useful for palace construction. Nero blamed the Christians. The Christians blamed Nero. The Christians wrote the history. The truth of who started the fire in 64 AD is lost in centuries of narratives written by the winners of a theological argument that Nero lost by dying first and leaving no survivors to contest the account. 95. The 100 Years' War was primarily about English dynastic claims to the French throne, a straightforward conflict between England and France over succession rights, fought for over a century until France successfully expelled the English and resolved the dynastic question. The conflict was simultaneously about Gascon and Flemish commercial interests, internal French feudal politics, and shifting alliances that made it as much a French civil war as an Anglo-French confrontation, with French nobles sometimes more loyal to the English king than to their own crown. Gascony in southwestern France was an English possession, generating enormous wine trade revenue, and had been under English control since Eleanor of Aquitaine's marriage to Henry II in 1152, roughly 180 years before the war began, making commercial control of Gascon trade as much a motivation as any dynastic claim. The war was simultaneously a French civil war. The Armagnac-Burgundian conflict within France saw the Duchy of Burgundy ally with England against the Armagnac faction supporting the French crown. French nobles fighting French nobles with English backing, and English nobles fighting alongside French ones against the French king. Flemish cities, dependent on English wool for their cloth industry, supported England for commercial reasons that had no dynastic dimension whatsoever. Joan of Arc's significance was not purely military. Her emergence reframed the conflict from a dynastic dispute in which English claims had arguable legal basis into a national conflict, creating a French identity narrative that had not previously existed in its modern form. She did not just fight the English. She invented France as an idea worth dying for, which is a more consequential achievement than winning any battle she fought in. 96. Vikings were primarily raiders and pillagers, the defining image of Norse culture, brutal maritime warriors descending from longships to burn, plunder, and terrorize coastal Europe. The original barbarians of the medieval period, whose reputation for violence has never required qualification. While Viking raiding was real and significant, the majority of Norse people during the Viking Age were farmers, traders, and settlers, whose commercial and colonial activities were economically transformative rather than purely destructive, and whose geographic reach reshaped the medieval world in ways that fire and plunder alone cannot explain. Norse traders established and dominated trade routes from Scandinavia through Russia to Constantinople and the Islamic world, conducting commerce in furs, amber, and other goods that made Scandinavian merchants a consistent presence in the markets of the known world. The city of Dublin was founded by Norse settlers in 841. Normandy was settled by Vikings in 911 and became the launching pad for the Norman conquest of England in 1066, meaning the most consequential invasion in English history was executed by people of direct Norse descent, 2 generations removed from the original settlers. Norse seafarers reached Iceland around 874, Greenland around 985, and the North American continent around 1000 AD, an expansion across the North Atlantic, representing one of the most remarkable, sustained feats of maritime navigation in the medieval world. The Viking Age is a modern historian's category, applied to a diverse population, that included farmers, craftspeople, merchants, poets, legal scholars, and administrators alongside the raiders that popular culture remembers exclusively. The longships carried considerably more silk than the reputation suggests. 97. The sinking of the Lusitania on May 7, 1915, was a surprise attack that shocked America into entering World War I. an act of unprovoked German aggression against an innocent civilian vessel that directly caused American entry into the conflict. Germany had published specific warnings in American newspapers about the Lusitania before its final voyage, and American entry into World War I did not happen until April 1917. Nearly 2 years after the sinking, a gap that the causal narrative requires you to overlook entirely. The Imperial German Embassy published a notice in American newspapers on May 1, 1915, the same day the Lusitania departed New York, warning that ships flying Allied flags in the war zone around Britain were liable to be attacked without further warning. The Lusitania was carrying a cargo that included small arms ammunition and other war materials, making its status as a purely civilian vessel legally ambiguous under the international maritime law of the period. 1,198 people died in the sinking, including 128 Americans, a genuine atrocity that produced genuine outrage. The United States did not enter World War I until April 1917, nearly 2 years later, and the immediate triggers for that entry were the resumption of unrestricted submarine warfare and the Zimmermann telegram, Germany's decoded proposal that Mexico attack the United States in exchange for territorial concessions. The Lusitania is remembered as the event that pulled America into a war that America did not enter for 23 months afterward. History needed a cleaner cause and effect than the combination of decoded cables, submarine policy shifts, and accumulated public opinion that actually moved Congress. And a burning ship full of civilians made a more memorable story than a diplomatic telegram. 98, the Soviet Union lost the space race. America versus the Soviets, culminating in Apollo 11's moon landing in July 1969. America wins. The Soviets concede defeat, and the competition concludes in unambiguous American triumph that closes the chapter definitively. The Soviets achieved most of the space race's significant early milestones first, never formally conceded defeat, continued substantial space program achievements after 1969, and built the first continuously inhabited space station, a record that complicates the clean American victory narrative considerably. Soviet space firsts include the first satellite, Sputnik in 1957, the first living creature in orbit, Laika in 1957, the first human in space, Yuri Gagarin in 1961, the first spacewalk, Alexei Leonov in 1965, the first woman in space, Valentina Tereshkova in 1963, and the first spacecraft to successfully land on another planet, Venera 7 on Venus in 1970. The Soviet Union never acknowledged losing the space race. Soviet officials argued they had chosen not to pursue a manned moon landing as a primary goal, pivoting instead to space station technology and long-duration spaceflight, where Soviet expertise led American programs for years. The Soviet Mir space station, operational from 1986 to 2001, hosted over 100 cosmonauts for extended missions and accumulated far more experience with long-duration spaceflight than American programs of the same era. Winning the space race is an American framing of a competition whose finish line the Americans defined unilaterally. The Soviets kept running in a different direction and called it a different race. Everyone won the race they decided to enter. History declared one winner anyway, and has been celebrating ever since. 99, Magna Carta, in 1215, established democracy and rights for all Englishmen. The foundational document of English liberty, the ancestor of modern democratic governance. The moment King John was forced to recognize the fundamental rights of his subjects and the principle of legal equality took its first definitive form. Magna Carta was a feudal contract between a king and his barons protecting the privileges of the aristocratic elite, had nothing to do with ordinary English people, and was annulled by the Pope within weeks of being signed. A sequence of events that the founding of liberty narrative requires, leaving almost entirely out of the account. Of Magna Carta's 63 original clauses, the vast majority concerned feudal obligations, the rights of barons and the church, and specific property and legal arrangements between the crown and the nobility. Ordinary English subjects are largely invisible in the document as rights-bearing individuals. Pope Innocent III annulled Magna Carta in August 1215, approximately 10 weeks after it was signed at Runnymede, declaring it null and void of all validity forever at King John's own request. It became operative law only in subsequent revised versions issued after John's death. The celebrated clause about no one being imprisoned except by the lawful judgment of his peers referred to noble peers judging nobles, not to jury trials for ordinary subjects, a meaning it was retrospectively assigned centuries later by lawyers who needed historical precedent. Magna Carta's significance as a document of popular liberty was largely constructed by 17th century English lawyers and parliamentarians who read their own contemporary concerns back into a medieval feudal agreement between a king and his wealthiest subjects. It established that the king could not arbitrarily imprison barons without following specific rules. It became the foundation of universal rights through centuries of reinterpretation by people who needed it to mean something considerably larger than it said. 100 history's great atrocities were committed by uniquely evil, pathological individuals whose personal monstrousness explains the monstrousness of their acts. The monster theory of historical evil, which locates the source of organized atrocity in the aberrant psychology of specific perpetrators rather than in the conditions that enabled and sustained them. The most significant finding of 20th century social psychology and Holocaust scholarship is that ordinary people, under specific social conditions, carry out extraordinary evil, a conclusion more structurally disturbing than the monster theory it challenges, because it does not permit the comfortable distance that monsters provide. Hannah Arendt's reporting on the 1961 Adolf Eichmann trial produced the phrase, "the banality of evil." Observing that Eichmann was not a fanatic monster, but a bureaucratic functionary who organized mass murder with administrative efficiency and claimed throughout his trial that he was following orders and doing his job. Stanley Milgram's obedience experiments in the 1960s demonstrated that approximately 65% of ordinary American volunteers would administer what they believed to be dangerous electric shocks to strangers when instructed to do so by an authority figure in a controlled laboratory setting. Christopher Browning's historical research on Reserve Police Battalion 101, published as Ordinary Men in 1992, documents in granular detail how ordinary middle-aged German men adapted to institutional roles that required systematic killing of civilians, without prior ideological fanaticism as a prerequisite. The monster theory of evil is psychologically useful because it implies that ordinary people are categorically safe from complicity, and therefore does not require examining the social conditions, institutional pressures, and gradual normalization that the historical evidence repeatedly identifies as the actual mechanism through which atrocities are sustained. History keeps the monsters because they are easier than the alternative. The alternative requires everyone to take seriously the structures they are currently living inside. 101. We have learned from history's mistakes. The foundational premise of studying the past, the reason this subject is taught in schools, the implicit promise that awareness of what went wrong before will produce better decisions going forward, and a civilization progressively less likely to repeat its worst patterns. The historical record is unambiguous. Humanity systematically repeats the same categories of error across centuries, and the people living inside each repetition consistently believe their situation is different enough from the historical precedents that the precedents do not apply to them. Financial manias and their subsequent collapses have occurred with remarkable regularity. The Dutch tulip mania of 1637, the South Sea bubble of 1720, the railway speculation of the 1840s, the 1929 crash, the dot-com collapse of 2000, and the 2008 financial crisis all follow structurally identical patterns of speculative overconfidence, rationalized in each case as justified by the unique conditions of the current moment. Economists Carmen Reinhart and Kenneth Rogoff documented in their study of 8 centuries of financial history that the defining characteristic of financial crises across that entire span is participants' consistent belief that this time is different, that the pattern no longer applies because something fundamental has changed. The same myth structures present throughout this video: the false attribution, the simplified cause, the reassuring lie about a complex truth, the villain constructed to explain a systemic failure, appear in every era of documented history without exception. The 101 items in this video are a representative sample from a list that has no natural end, because myth-making is not a historical failure mode. It is an ongoing process occurring right now in things you currently believe with the same confidence that previous generations believed the things on this list. The only difference between the myths here and the ones you currently hold is that someone hasn't made the video yet. Drop the one you're still defending in the comments. That's where the real conversation starts. If you want to see more, click the video on screen now.